Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Protector of the Fairies in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Protector of the Fairies. Meeting the Quincy King. Leaning against the wall, Bambietta let out a yawn as she tried to keep her mind occupied so she wouldn't be reminded of how boring the task she had assigned to her was. It wasn't working, not when she was trying to block out the chatter from the prisoners nearby. This job was boring. So boring that she was almost tempted to risk abandoning her post for an hour to go get something to eat. All that was stopping her was the potential wrath from Wywak himself, as she didn't dare push him any further as she stood right now. Luckily she only had a week or two more of this and then she'd be free, able to return to the battlefield and cause as much chaos as she pleased. It would be far more enjoyable than it was right now. The only people she could talk to during these hours were the prisoners. The other guards with her, always two soldats, were too terrified of her to speak. They probably thought she would blow them up if they annoyed her. She had no idea why they thought such a thing. The others she had killed had been because they couldn't entertain her after they annoyed her, not because they simply were a pain to be around. Still, maybe the ones here today would be better company than usual. Raising her voice, she turned to the nearest and began to say, "Hey Dash," before freezing as an arrow whipped past her face, slamming into the nearest soldat's head. The other made to draw her sword before an arrow hit her too, piercing her heart in one swift instant. "You're either brave or stupid," Bambietta stated as she drew her sword, pointing it towards the doorway where the arrow had come from. "Show yourself and I'll go easy on you." "That's a lie," said Uriah as he stepped into sight. "You'd fight just as cruelly as any other time." "Uriah." Bambietta's confused frown instantly morphed into a wide grin as she realized what his appearance meant. "You're doing this now, huh?" "Yes. You have the keys to the cells." Bambietta simply threw the keys at him in response, Uriah catching them as he walked forward, allowing the others to enter the room from behind him. "Thank you. This makes our job much easier. Glad my boredom was worth something to you." She paused as she noticed the glare she got as Ichigo passed her. "What's his to wait, member of Fairy Tail?" "Forgot about that. Would it help if I apologize for those rune nights?" "Don't bother," Ichigo shot back as he headed further down into the cells with Uriah, Kisuke following behind while the others watched the doorway with Bambietta. "You wouldn't mean it." Bambietta shrugged, uncaring about the response she got. "True. Your friends are down at the fourth cell on the right." "Ah, not you," she added, grabbing Karen before she could try and rush after the others. "You're the princess's twin sister, right?" "Princess. What else am I going to call her considering how she's treated? She's one of Wywaka's favorites right now. Which means she isn't down here. A dirty cell is no place for someone with such pure magic. She'll be upstairs somewhere. Where I have no idea, but you can bet she isn't anywhere near here." Listening as well to her words from the distance for a moment, Ichigo continued his path down after Uriah, heading towards the cells. Despite what Bambietta had claimed, these cells weren't dirty in the slightest. They were spotless, not a speck of imperfection in place. If anything, he noted that they seemed too perfect, as if nothing could ever be wrong with them. Those thoughts quickly passed though as he came face to face with a set of bars. His mind briefly flashed back to the time where he had been on the other side of a set like these, Natsu and the others appearing much to his own surprise. One of the set of eyes that turned towards him widened in surprise. It was obvious he was not the person Gildarts had expected to see, and he could see the man slowly begin to smile at the sight of him. Wendy meanwhile was looking at him just like she normally did. She didn't even seem surprised that he was here, or rather it was more like she had already known he would come and had never doubted those thoughts. "Glad to see you're in good shape," Ichigo joked as he called out to Gildarts, Uriah beside him fiddling with the keys to get the door open. "Though I think you've lost some weight." Gildarts chuckled, carefully getting up on his one foot and leaning against the wall. It was a difficult action and Wendy had to rush to keep him steady when he threatened to fall over, but he managed it in the end. "Better than the alternative, I suppose. I thought I was dead. For a brief while I did too. I suppose I was lucky Wywak was in such a forgiving mood. If he wasn't, I'm pretty sure I'd be dead too, or at least captured as well." Gildarts let out a louder laugh this time, some of his usual cheer returning. "Probably. He's ridiculously strong. People have compared me to a monster for years and he neutralized everything I had like he wasn't even trying. I wouldn't fancy my chances against him again as I am now. You think you can still fight like that? Kisuk asked as he stepped into view, having purposefully hidden to give them all a moment. It seemed though that Gildarts wasn't upset at all about it, his smile growing wider than before. Kisuk. Considering you came here too. He bowed his head briefly, the movement making him sway for a moment before he leaned back against the wall. Thank you my friend. Think nothing of it, Kisuk said as the cell door finally opened, quickly slipping past Urayu as the Quincy backed away to check his friend's condition. There are very few people I actually would go aid if they needed me. You were barely on that list for the simple reason that I never believed you actually would need help from me. You should be glad I threw you on there anyway. Gildarts laughed, leaning forward onto the man as he approached and causing Kisuk to quickly grab him before he could fall. He felt Gildart's head brush against his own for a moment and it was only then he realized that this was the man's attempt at a hug in his current state, lacking the arms he normally would have used. Thank you for coming Kisuk. Of course, Kisuk finally said, speaking without jokes and instead simply fondly. What are friends for? Ichigo smiled at the scene for a moment, the sight unusual one considering how Kisuk normally was, before the small tugging at his shirt caused his attention to flicker down towards his right. His head turned properly and glanced down to see a pair of small eyes looking up at him, a wide smile across the girl's face. You came for us, Wendy said, though it sounded more like a statement of fact than words of happiness. I knew you would. Of course, Ichigo replied. Sorry. It was my fault you got taken. I could have stopped them when they took you. I could have stopped you teaming up with us too. But I didn't. I'm sorry. Wendy glanced to the man beside him, recognizing Urayu for the first time since he had arrived with them. Her eyes widened momentarily before she turned her head back towards him, her smile staying in place. He was on your side wasn't he? Wywak seemed annoyed that he had lost him but he was never an enemy was he? Correct Miss Marvel, stated Urayu as he turned back towards the way they had come from. Apologizes for your treatment here. I'll make it up to you later on if you so wish. You have my word. For now Ichigo I'm going to keep an eye out on the others. Be quick here and get them ready to move. We'll be as quick as we can, replied Ichigo as he turned back towards Wendy. I had a feeling but... Kelia? Where is she? By Waiwaka's side. Thought so, Ichigo muttered in annoyance. We'll have to grab her and make a run for it after we're done. She'll probably try to resist. We can try and calm her down but, if she doesn't there may be only one other option. We don't have to kill her. Exclaimed Wendy before noticing Ichigo was looking down at her in confusion. That's not what you're suggesting. Not for her. What is binding her isn't evil but an obsession. It may be possible to remove it. You can do that. Ichigo shook his head. Not me. All I could do to stop her would be to kill her. But as I said, there is another way if someone else does something. You. Reaching into his cloak he pulled out a familiar-looking orb, Wendy's eyes widening before her hands snatched out towards it. She was about to grab it when she paused, remembering her manners and looking up for permission. Just take it. He didn't talk to me once with you not around. It's you he wants to be beside. Wendy needed no further prompting, taking the lacrima that held Nabara into both hands and holding it close to her chest. Already she could feel the familiar warmth she had grown used to feeling from it, the magic swirling within gaining more life to it in response to her presence. I missed you Nabara. And I you Wendy, she heard his voice say to her right. Turning towards him she noticed he was only half there, his form distorted with only his face truly clear. It was enough though since she could see the same look of happiness that she herself was wearing. You are looking well all things considered. I did worry. What about you? You look like you can barely hold your form. A side effect of trying to manifest after so long while running on very little energy. I'll be back to normal soon. Your magic will make sure of that. Glancing towards Ichigo he gave him and Mavis a nod, the girl on Ichigo's shoulder giving a wave at her fellow consciousness of magic. Protect her as best you can, Nabara simply said towards him before vanishing. Despite his lack of presence though, Wendy could still feel him through the lacrima she now held once again. She looked around a bit as she fiddled with the lacrima before frowning. My staff's not here. Sorry, but that's not exactly easy to carry when I need my hands free for my swords. It's back on the ship. You'll have to carry Nabera carefully for now. Wendy nodded, clutching the lacrima closer to her chest. You said I could help Kelia. Yes. I won't pretend to know much about how Nirvana works. All Mavis understands is that it is the magic that has allowed you to alter the energy in the world, whether it's something massive like switching the light and dark in a person's heart to doing what you did when you fought Kelia to manipulate the gravitational forces around you to force your strike to hit. You saw my fight. I heard about it. Mavis worked out the rest through Nabera. He may not talk to me much, but she's another matter. He frowned. Where was I? You were unsure of how Nirvana works. Right. I may not know, but that is only because the only one who does is Nabera, the consciousness of the magic itself. He would never tell me. Not out of spite, mind you, but because he would never share the secrets of his magic with anyone but his wielder. It's why Mavis has no quarrels with telling me all the secrets of her magic, because, to her, I am the one person who should know them. Generally that person who wields one of these magic would be Anukin, but they are only the preferred hosts because they will always have the magic capacity to support them in some way. But a sky magic wielder is a close second, if only because of their sight. So while he may not tell me, he continued, he would certainly tell you. The fact he accepts your magic is proof that you are his wielder. All you have to do is ask and he will answer. That is how simple it is. He'll tell me just because I ask. Wendy asked in concern. What if he didn't want to? His magic is so heavily linked to the Nervits. I don't want him to remember those times if it causes him pain. He won't care, Mavis stated. My life had some skeletons and I didn't care about revealing them. The pain might be there, but there is joy too. He'll be happy to tell you because you are the only one he wants to tell these things to. You heard Mavis, Ichigo added, and she's a much better expert on these matters than I am. That's why it will be up to you. It will be more advanced than what you did with gravity, I assume, but you should be able to save Kelia. Remove the obsession by altering it or replacing it with something else. If the darkness in someone's heart can be changed by this magic, then it stands to reason their very mind can be altered in some fashion or another. It'll work. I think. Either way, it's better than the alternative. Wendy paled at the image of her friend dying. I'll do it. I have to try. That's more like it, Ichigo said with a smile, ruffling her head for a moment before turning towards Gildarts. The man himself was still occupied with Kisuke, who was checking all three of the areas where the man's missing limbs had been, likely already trying to work out how to best replace them. How is he? Truthfully. Wendy shook her head. He's not good. They let me close his wounds, but, well, you saw how he moved. He can't move without support unless he is willing to hop everywhere. He's been giving it a try during our time here and he has gotten good at it, but he won't be able to run away that fast, right? Right. I can't fix limbs without the limb itself. I can only stop him bleeding out. Maybe if Kelia and I worked together we might have a chance, but I'm not sure. Her regeneration is always stronger on herself than other people. Another reason to try and save her then, Ichigo muttered to himself before glancing back at Wendy. How obsessed is Kelia with you still? Less than before, but still enough to keep visiting me frequently. If she realizes they're being attacked, she may come to check on me for my protection. All right, we can work with that. I want you and Gildarts to keep out of sight down here and wait for her. Once you manage to turn her back to our side, see if you can at least get Gildarts' leg back. If you can, he'll be able to run freely. If not, inform Hibiki. I'll tell him to make sure he's in close contact with you at all times. I'd leave some of the others down here with you, but you need them on the front lines too. It's all right. I understand. Thanks. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry I dragged you into this mess. After today I promise you that I won't ever do it again. Wendy frowned, looking up at him curiously. Did something happen? She didn't miss how he turned away, nor how for a moment his eyes had seemed to lose their life. Are you ? Nothing's the matter, Wendy, Ichigo said as he cut her off. I'll be leaving this matter to you. Remember that if you get into trouble, do tell Hibiki. We didn't come all this way to rescue you and the others only for you to die on us. Glancing back over at Gildarts, Ichigo added, make sure she listens Gildarts. You got that? Gildarts gave a nod, a sad expression on his face as he watched the others beginning to leave. Good luck, he called out, traces of envy in his voice. If I could join you I would. We'll be happy enough with you coming home safely. Stay safe. Heading back to the others, Ichigo glanced at Kisuke before asking, are you sure you don't want to stay? Kisuke shook his head. They'll be fine. I'm sure of it. Besides, you'll need me to help take down the barrier. Suppose I will. Reaching the others, he noticed how Karen was glaring daggers at Bambietta, the Quincy girl not even showing the slightest bit of guilt. Everyone else ready to move out. Where are the others? Gray asked, Ichigo pointing back over his shoulder. Released. Wendy said she thinks Kelia will come to her when they get attacked, so she's going to be the bait to draw her out. She's also the only one of us able to perhaps turn her back to our side. Now we need to work on our other targets. Gray, Kisuke, I want you two going after the barrier. If Kisuke can't shut it down, you need to manually freeze it, Gray. Your curse should be powerful enough to do the trick. I'm going after Yuzo, Karen declared before Ichigo could even turn to her, Ichigo sighing reluctantly before nodding. I've said you can before. Taoshiro, keep her out of trouble. Yuzo seems to be a prize to Wiwak, so her guards will be many, I'd reckon. Extract her as quickly as you can and then retreat back down to here and regroup with Gildarts and Wendy. It'll make it easier for Nozomi or Mest to extract all of you at once. Meanwhile Urayu and I will go up and deal with Wiwak. What about me? Bambietta asked. I'm not doing this unless I get some fun after all. Want me to kill some people? Just cause some chaos on the surface and make sure the Quincy stay busy. Should be easy for you. Just don't catch any of us in the blasts or go for our reinforcements when the barrier drops. Alright to the second, can't promise the first. What, I can't know where you lot are all the time. She added when she noticed the looks being sent at her. I'm not going to hold back for anyone anymore. Just show some restraint on where you fire at least, Urayu muttered in annoyance before walking towards the doorway. We've wasted enough time here. Ichigo, let's go. Wiwak will undoubtedly be waiting for us by now, unless by some miracle he hasn't noticed our presence. I doubt that, Ichigo replied as he moved to join him. Let's go then. To deal with the king. Protector of the fairies. Something's off, Urayu muttered, glancing down the corridor carefully for any sign of trouble. Pulling back he turned towards Ichigo and clarified, we still haven't seen anyone. There's no sign of any Quincy anywhere, and yet we're only a minute away from Wiwak at most. Where is everyone? Maybe we got lucky. Ichigo replied, looking just as worried as Urayu at the lack of Quincy presence. Maybe Wiwak had already sent his forces out for a concentrated attack before we arrived. Urayu frowned before shaking his head. No, they're still here. I sensed them not long ago. Wiwak must be hiding their presence. He can do that. You understand the principle of shielding someone's presence by overwhelming them with your own magical power? It's a similar principle, only Wiwak takes it to the extreme. Rather than using brute force, he perfectly manipulates his own energy to shield the energy of others while keeping his output at the same noticeable level. It's honestly frightening how he can wield such fine-grained precision with his magic like this. Can he shield many with this? No idea, Urayu shot back in annoyance in an attempt to hide his worry. Assume anyone within a mile has had their magical power overlapped with his own to subtly hide it. It'll take too long for Mavis to trace it back and unravel all of his work, so we'll just need to push on. Follow me. Heading forward quickly, he moved down the corridor as quietly as he could afford to before peeking around the last corner to their destination. The second he did, he pulled his head back instantly, pressing his back against the wall as far as he could go. Crap, he whispered quietly, turning towards Ichigo with a look of fear on his face. Using one hand he gestured at the corner before using both hands to hold up 7 fingers. Getting the message, Ichigo carefully moved to join Urayu, allowing Mavis to leap over the two of them to peer down the corridor secretly. "So there they are," Mavis replied softly, looking back towards Ichigo and Uriah. "We're looking at 2 rows of 3, one on each side of the corridor beside the doorway. The last is standing right before the doorway." She frowned as she looked back, her eyes widening as she saw the man turn towards her. "He sees me." "What?" Uriah whispered at her. "Who is?" "Is a tall man. Long blonde hair and a large broadsword at his side." "Correct on all 3 counts. He's not Nukin nor a sky magic user from what I can tell. You can only see me because you're connected to Ichigo through the fragment of Waiwaka's power you both share. Does this man possess something similar?" Uriah nodded. "His name is Jugram and he's meant to be the other half to Waiwaka in case the worst was to happen. He's capable of even temporarily gaining Waiwaka's power if Waiwaka himself is willing to allow the transfer, though it only lasts as long as he wills it to. The fact a connection exists between the two of them must be allowing him to share Waiwaka's sight." Frowning, he asked, "What's Jugram doing?" "He noticed us, right?" "He's gesturing at us," Mavis muttered back, as confused at the action as they were at hearing about it. "You were right about Waiwaka knowing we were here. I just never expected for him to roll out the welcome mat for us. Maybe he hasn't realized I've betrayed him yet." Uriah scoffed at his own idea before pushing back off against the wall and began adjusting his uniform. "Make yourself presentable. We might as well try on the off chance luck is on our side." Adjusting his cloak last, Uriah took a step around the corner, Ichigo reluctantly following his ally's lead. The second he did so all the Quincy moved into action. His hand was about to snap down to grab one of his blades before he froze at the sight before him. All 6 Quincy lined up had kneeled before them, only the Quincy known as Jugram standing before them as he patiently waited for them to approach. "His Majesty has been expecting your return, Uriah," he replied simply before glancing towards Ichigo. "He will be most happy to see that you have brought Ichigo Kurosaki with you too. Please, go straight ahead." Taking one step to the side, Jugram took his hand closest to his sword away from his body and rested it against the handle to the door. Glancing at Uriah for a moment, Ichigo frowned at what they were meant to do before watching as Uriah began to take steps forward, reluctantly following the Quincy's lead. As they approached the door, Jugram pulled it open for them, not making a single move of aggression as they passed him. It didn't stop Ichigo's nerves from staying on high alert, his eyes scanning each Quincy as they passed while Mavis continued to look behind him at the enemy Quincy. Finally they were in the room they had been looking for though, the door slowly being shut behind them. And resting there on an elevated throne sat the man they had been looking for. "Waiwaka. So you have finally arrived, my children," Waiwaka spoke softly, his hands pushing against the arms of his throne as he got to his feet. "I have been expecting you ever since I sensed the disturbance nearby. I am glad you have finally decided to rejoin me once again for a talk like this, Ichigo. And I am also thankful to see that Uriah is in as perfect health as when he left. I assume you were satisfied with the conditions of your friends down in the prison." "You lived up to my expectations," Ichigo reluctantly admitted. "Where's Yuzo?" "Miss Kurosaki is currently resting in her rooms," Waiwaka replied, slowly taking each step down the throne as they continued to approach. "She had a hard day and needed to recover her strength after the strain of repeatedly using her magic." "Have you sent her twin sister after her to save her?" Waiwaka sighed at the shocked look on Ichigo's face. "I doubted you came alone, and I have done enough research on your family to know the traits of many of you Kurosakis. Understanding all that I knew, I figured out of all the others she would be the most aggressive in her attempts to visit here. It was a reasonable assumption to make, and I'm honestly surprised it has taken her this long to try something considering her, let us say, aggressive tendencies in the attempt of being polite." Turning his gaze away from Ichigo, Waiwaka settled his eyes on Uriah before letting out a disappointed sigh. "You know I had such high hopes for you, Uriah. Your marksmanship is truly a sight to behold. With your eyesight and skillful control over your magical power, you have continuously improved your accuracy at distances greater than any Quincy ever has achieved. Even I cannot boost such a claim. It truly does make a father proud to see his sons grow with such strides." "I'm not your son," Uriah replied. "I'm an Ishida." "Of course. You always did have that stubbornness from Ryukin. I only know him through memories, and honestly the love your mother had for him was refreshing to see after the suffering of the souls I witnessed before then. I had hoped that was all you would have inherited from him, but apparently you also inherited his craftiness from him too. Such a shame. I had truly hoped you would have stayed loyal to me. And I still do. You know why we're here, Waiwak, Ichigo spoke up, drawing both swords from their sheaths. Don't pretend like this can end through words. Of course I'm aware, replied Waiwak calmly. You have both come to betray me. Ichigo, I always suspected, but I did have my hopes. Uryu, however, well, you always had been my most loyal soldier. You were the first to reach me, even before Jugram, and for that I always held you in such high esteem. It was why I didn't want to believe that you, of all my children, could ever betray me. At least until Giselle. Holding out one hand as he reached the end of the stairs of his throne, he slashed straight at his other hand, leaving a faint cut along the surface. He then turned the palm towards them for them to watch as the blood leaked down from the ground and onto the floor. If I had Giselle's power, I should have been able to heal from this very quickly. It wouldn't be too hard for a wound of this magnitude to repair itself. But that power never reached me, nor did her memories. Everything that made Giselle who she was, I never received any of it. All I got were some memories that, even to her, appear to be as if I was watching a silent film, lacking any life to them. I wasn't even sure whose soul I was listening to for a while, but eventually it clicked. But I have to admit, it stumped me for a while, he added. A soul without memories does not exist naturally. Even if the mind lacks them, the soul will always remember. But I couldn't find them, meaning they had been ripped out with one of the most impressive pieces of memory magic that I have had the pleasure of bearing witness to. But it was her lack of power that truly piqued my curiosity. There is no one on this earth that can take away the power of a Quincy except myself. Until I realized that there was others with that same potential. My sons. I thought I already said it, Uryu snapped back. We're not your sons. We never have been. I would beg to differ, stated Waiwak as he did the one thing they never expected him to. He turned his back to them, walking away towards the massive wall behind his throne. It was as if the idea they could attack him right then never occurred to him. Or if it did, it meant that he didn't even consider the need to be worried about such an outcome. You do understand how much you two owe to me, correct? I'm not sure we owe you anything, Ichigo snarled back, resisting the urge to lash out then and there in case it was some elaborate trap being set up for them. What could we possibly owe to you? My power. Waiwak replied back calmly. But really it is much more than that. With my power it was a fair trade at the time. My freedom from darkness in exchange for the strength you two would gain. But look at you both. He stopped at the edge of the wall and turned back towards them, holding a hand out towards Uryu. Uryu. You are, in my personal opinion, the greatest Quincy of this era bearing myself. Your raw talent is incredible to see. Give it a few more years and your strength will grow to even greater heights, I guarantee it. And you Ichigo, Waiwak continued as he moved his hand across, well, look at your own existence. Your mother was a powerful Quincy, but the power you would have obtained from her would have been far inferior to the massive amount of Shinigami magic you would have inherited from your father. If it was not for the presence of my power, mingling with her own and bringing it to heights beyond the powers any Quincy newborn should possess, you would have been just a simple Shinigami. Maybe a Shinigami with hollow powers if you were lucky. Pausing for a second, Waiwak let out a brief laugh. When I think about it, I suppose it makes me more responsible for your current strength than even Kisukura Hara. I was the one who allowed you the chance to become a hybrid. I was the one who allowed you the chance to reach the levels of power you now possess. And it all stems back to that one decision I made so long ago. What would I call you both if not my sons when so much of your development was because of my influence? Let's stop with this pointless chatting, Ichigo snarled before a hand shot out in front of him. Uryu. Hold on a minute, Uryu requested quietly before taking steps towards Waiwak. You're saying this because you have yet to designate us as enemies, correct? That is what that performance outside was for, right? My heir should have the proper welcome whenever he returns, Waiwak replied simply. All Quincy are my children. I love them as such, but I am also aware that my concept of love is not the same as others. I can feel the love of a parent, but I can never feel the love a husband may have for a wife. I will never marry and I will never produce an offspring. You two are the closest things I will ever have to biological sons. That is the only reason I have stayed my hand so far to this betrayal. Because out of respect to that, I am willing to look past this if you will stop your childish tantrums and accept the reality of the world. You mean accept your reality? Wywak simply smiled at the response. Is there really any difference? In the end, this world will be as I see it to be. Nothing more, nothing less. The nature of it is the same as the sun rising and setting each day, a fact that will continue to be true for far beyond our own lifetimes. And yet you still think we'll join you? Uriu asked in disgust. You are deluded if you think reality itself is something to bend to your will. Which is why I will stop you. Why we will stop you. Wywak sighed in disappointment before placing his hand against the wall beside him. In an instant the wall shattered into particles of blue light, floating around in the air and revealing the open ground in the distance beyond the walls of the palace. Did you bring enough men at least for this assault of yours? Uriu frowned, taking a few steps closer until he saw fields of white covering the far distance. Your forces, he muttered in fear, taking a step back in shock. That's impossible. This scale of troops, they weren't here when we infiltrated. You couldn't have withdrawn your entire army in this small amount of time. You are right, Wywak replied. I did not. This is simply the level of reserves I have at all times, ready to defend my kingdom in case of foolish children such as yourselves. How many men did you bring with you? I hardly think the few thousands you have are enough. Thousands? Asked Ichigo in confusion, sharing a look with Uriu. It wasn't missed by Wywak, the man looking utterly surprised for the first time since they had arrived. They aren't yours. He muttered. How interesting. They aren't hollows and they aren't demons, so that leaves only two possibilities. No, only one actually. Jushiro could take as many things, but even he wouldn't be so foolish to send you out here and not inform you of the troops in hiding. Which means Alvarez has finally decided to take action against me. I was wondering when they would. Clicking his fingers, the wall reformed behind him as he took a few steps towards them. In his right hand additional light burst to life in his palm, extending out and shaping into the solid form of a large sword. It only took another second for the energy to solidify, gaining a true physical form with the guard of an eaglet on the hilt of the blade. That, however, is a matter I can leave in the hands of my subjects. I have far more pressing matters to deal with. If you refuse to join me, I have no further use for you two. I will take back what is mine and then I will give you the gift of death. It is the last kindness I will grant you both, so you don't have to watch all your loved ones perishing by my hand. Protector of the fairies. Out of my way. Karen roared as she swung her blade forward, the large form of Amol releasing a wave of flames straight at the green-haired girl blocking her path. The Quincy showed no intention of trying to dodge, however, her body being coated with lightning as she swung her fist forward, releasing a blast of the energy straight forward. Not a chance. The Quincy screamed back, bringing her other hand quickly as she formed a bow of energy from the small pendant she held within her palm. Lightning continued to spark all along the bow as it formed, its form appearing to look almost unstable from the crackling energy that surrounded it. Meninas! Help me already! I can't right now, Candace! Called back a pink-haired female Quincy nearby, dodging a large pillar of ice that slammed into where she had just been standing. Reinforcing her hands in a layer of energy, she gripped the ice and pulled it free from the ground, throwing it right back at Toshiro and causing him to dart out of the way. Lalato? Some help please. I've got it, the smallest of the three Quincy replied, her mouth extended far away from her body as she finished eating the large amounts of ice nearby. All right, I'm full. Wiping her mouth clean as her flesh returned to normal, she took one look up at Toshiro before her mouth opened wide again. Toshiro took one look at the attack before he recognized the sight, having seen it plenty of times before from anyone who practiced Slayer-type magic. Nothing was said to trigger the spell, and instead a blizzard of ice burst forth from her open mouth, forcing him to swipe up with his sword and form a thin layer of ice to defend himself. It didn't hold, not against the quantity of ice being fired at him. But he could weather through such attacks, especially when it was ice. Hyorin Mera was not one to willingly allow another's ice to be superior to its own, and he could feel the spirit's restlessness within him, practically begging him to use his Bankai. He resisted the urge. It was far too soon to use it. They hadn't even reached Yuza yet, and he didn't want to burn through too much energy until he was sure reinforcements would be arriving soon. But he supposed he could indulge his Zanpakuta's pride slightly. Ice burst to life around his hands, layering them with a thin layer of ice into the shape of claws. The same happened with his feet, while a tail of ice began to form from the ice that coated his back, parallel to his spine. From that same ice formed the two large wings, thinner than his Bankai's and almost decorative for his ice drive. He had tried a few times to get rid of them, but his ice drive always seemed stronger with them than without, as if the presence of them reinforced the idea to his magic that he was a dragon with this magic and not human. Plus they had some advantages at times. Beating the wings just as he began to move forward, his Shunpo's speed doubled as the additional power sent him flying towards his enemies. His hand swung through the air first rather than his sword, releasing a large sweeping wave of ice spikes, extending forward from the ground between him and the small Quincy. His sword swung next as he spun, the blade hitting the skin of the pink-haired Quincy's skin and sending her flying. No blood dripped from his Zanpakuto, however, something he didn't have much time to think about when the final Quincy suddenly changed targets. Galvano Bolt. He barely dodged, the arrow of pure electricity flying right past his ear and slamming into the nearby wall. It shattered under the force, the arrow continuing through the rubble and hitting the next. The process repeated a few more times until he could finally see other side of the compound, 5 walls having fallen in the strike. Trying to take advantage of Candace's distraction, Karen rushed at her with Amol, flames exploding out from her back and arms as her Shunkao activated in full force. Driving the sword forward in one powerful thrust, she stabbed it right at where Candace was standing. At the last moment Candace transformed, turning into pure lightning and darting right behind her. Lightning was already beginning to coat her hand as she returned to normal, ready to fire it directly at Karen's exposed back, only for the same flames being released by Shunkao to intensify and fire back at her. Lalato made it just in time to save her, her mouth extending out wide enough to swallow all the flames launched at her. Those flames weren't held for long, Lalato turning immediately and firing it straight at Taoshiro. A dragon's roar met her breath attack, ice refusing to be pushed back by the flames that tried to melt their way through. Locked in the stalemate, Taoshiro missed it when Menina's landed behind him, slamming a fist straight into his back. The force sent him flying into his own breath attack's remains as he lost control of the spell, falling quickly into Lalato's own strike in the process as the flames consumed him. Wings of ice immediately extended around his form and then swiped out, battering the flames and revealing only minor burns across Taoshiro, most being rapidly cooled by the thin layers of ice his body was beginning to generate. Karen immediately appeared beside him, her back towards him as she pointed the tip of her sword towards the 2 Quincy on her side. "Any ideas here?" she whispered back to him, keeping both eyes locked on the Quincy before her. "Beside brute forcing this problem?" "None," Taoshiro replied back quietly. "They still have their Volstandig too. We may have little choice, but I'm reluctantly to play our hands too soon." "Then leave it to me," Karen replied quickly, cutting off Taoshiro as he tried to protest. "We've discussed this a few times before and we both know your Bankai is stronger. These girls are a pest because of their teamwork more than their strength, preventing us from fighting them like this when they keep switching targets and synchronizing their attacks as they are doing. So I'll try and crush at least one of them completely before they activate Volstandig, and then we should be able to handle one-on-one battles." "Fine with you. Go for the smallest then," Taoshiro shot back quietly. "Her power is annoying, but she's probably the weakest overall in terms of physical power going by how she's been fighting so far. Just be careful." "I will," Karen replied, her sword tilting till it was pointing upwards. Taoshiro immediately charged at Menina's as Karen's flames began to dim before they reignited with greater intensity than before, the faint trickle of heat being felt for the first time along her shoulders and back as she uttered 2 words she knew she shouldn't say together. "Bankai. Shunkao. Protector of the fairies. Flames of revenge, lightning of fury. Is this it?" Gray asked, staring at the odd array of magic circles painted across the ground in blood. "I'm not seeing much else." "This is indeed it," Kisuk answered him, crouched down beside the edge of the outer circle. Quite impressive, I have to say. The formula, despite having its base fueled by Quincy magic, actually derives its roots from a variety of other sources. Blood magic for stronger stability and localizing, to name one example, with a heavy amount of similarities from some of the defensive magic I saw Makarov use once upon a time. Can't quite work out where the power source is coming from though. Some of the runes indicate the power is being transmitted directly to it, so Wywak himself might be considered the battery that powers it all. Can you disable it anyway? Kisuk shook his head. Countermeasures have been put in place to prevent tampering. Wywak was thorough with his work. If any foreign energy enters the seal that doesn't contain traces of Quincy magic, it is set to release almost all its stored magical power in a massive pulse, large enough to kill anything in this room and disorientate anyone else close by. That includes the Quincy too, right? Targeted wave. The energy will simply wash over the Quincy as if they weren't there. A Quincy could take this down if they had the correct amount of knowledge, only because of the loophole that lets their energy be recognized in order to not kill them in cases like this. We're pretty much out of luck too, since none of us have Quincy abilities and the only two that do are locked in battle with Wywak himself. Plan B. Me, Gray muttered, joining Kisuk in crouching down beside the outer layer of blood. Carefully pulling at the glove on his right hand, he exposed it to the world, the air beneath his palm chilling ever so slightly from the close proximity to his skin. And you're sure this will work? He asked hesitantly, looking towards Kisuk for confirmation. I'm not interacting with the energy within, but are we sure that by disrupting it in this way it won't cause something to go off? Not if you freeze it fast enough, Kisuk answered, his eyes scanning through the rest of the runes he could see. Theoretically it should be fine. The energy threatening to be released is still magic, and your curse should be powerful enough to seal it away before it can do any harm. You were able to neutralize Ichigo's regeneration in the areas your ice touched, so it should work here too. You can do it. Gray glanced back at his circle before looking at his hand again confidently. All right. Let's do this. Bringing his hand down, he touched it against the edge of the blood, ice instantly spreading from the point of contact. He wasted no time in projecting it all forward, freezing the entire array that generated the barrier before it could even register anything was wrong. He held his breath for a second, glancing around as if waiting for something to go wrong. Did it work? Kisuk frowned, getting back to his feet as he walked back towards the doorway of the room they were in. Peering out for a brief moment, he turned his gaze upwards to the sky before retreating back, shutting the door quietly. Kisuk. One moment please, Kisuk replied, his usual calm tone replaced by a warning in it. Something's wrong. Something's wrong. Gray frowned himself, looking back at the barrier's source he had frozen. It worked, didn't it? The whole array's frozen. The barrier is still up though, Kisuk replied, one hand resting beneath his chin in thought. What did we miss? He muttered quietly to himself. Was the array only for stabilization? There were parts of it I couldn't quite understand. An ancient form of language Wywak knew? Still should have worked. If it was only for stabilization, then the barrier should have shown signs of unraveling. Beginning to pace around the room, Kisuk let his eyes wander back to the frozen runes. Regeneration maybe? If the barrier is formed by Wywak, perhaps this is meant to only perform the act of regenerating the barrier upon taking damage, saving Wywak the effort of repairing it manually if engaged with enemy combatants. No, still doesn't add up right. This barrier isn't the largest compared to the ones I've studied before. With the amount of control Wywak has, it should be easy to split up a tiny part of his focus on repairing the damage. But it should still need some form of stability somewhere, some kind of grounding point to set the barrier down on. But where? Pausing in his strides, Kisuk's eyes shot to the ceiling of the room and began to scan any areas that looked out of place. Kisuk? Gray asked, Kisuk's actions finally becoming too much for his nerves to handle. What's going on? This wasn't the barrier's focus, Kisuk summarized. That's the best conclusion I can come to with the evidence I'm looking at. Despite being gone, the barrier remains. For a barrier permanently situated like this one, it needs a grounding point, otherwise the user will struggle to properly keep it situated correctly. Just look at Fairies' sphere. Ah yes, That barrier is an impressive one. It was a good case study for us. Bennyheim was already drawn the second the voice from behind them finished speaking, pointed directly at the source of the noise. Gray was on high alert too, a large patch of ice spreading out from where he stood as a large trident of ice began to extend up from its surface. Is that really necessary? No, it really isn't. Get rid of them. The trident in Gray's hand shattered to pieces while at the same time Kisuk found his Zanpakuto almost pulled from his grasp as a large crack formed along its surface. The newcomer before them sighed as he stepped towards them, one hand being pulled through short messy blonde hair. That's a Zanpakuto, right? No wonder it didn't shatter like I wanted it to. Aesu's will gets carried along with them and even magic resists their destruction by my hands. Such a shame. I could have ended this far quicker if that had worked. Glancing at the fragments of ice still clutched in his hand from his weapon, Gray looked back at the man in disbelief. The man was obviously a Quincy, the white uniform gave it away, but looking closely it became far more apparent that this Quincy looked far more like a child, despite the voice heard. The Quincy smirked at him when he noticed him observing him, a pair of red eyes locking with his own and sending a chill down his spine. And you are? Kisuk asked, taking a step forward towards the Quincy. The Quincy simply smiled in response as he turned back to face Kisuk and spoke his name. Gremi Thaumo. His Majesty's visionary. So then I assume you are the barrier's missing link, continued Kisuk suspiciously. You appeared quite quickly and out of nowhere, almost as if this array was all one elaborate warning system to alert any people of any invaders. The Quincy tilted his head before speaking two words. What array? Kisuk frowned at Gremi's words before carefully taking a step back, angling his body so he could see both Gremi and the original array. Only he could only see one of them and there wasn't even ice where the second should have been. Now that's interesting, he muttered softly, his eyes narrowing as he focused all his attention on Gremi completely. You're far more dangerous than you look, you know that? Gray, be careful. He can dash. Any attempts Kisuk had left at speaking were completely destroyed when all the skin from his body was torn away. His muscles were contorted and his vocal cords shattered as he fell to the ground, his Zanpakuto digging into the ground beside him. And yet despite his state, the movements of his chest could be seen as his body still tried to function as it normally should, air being pulled into his lungs despite the agonizing pain such an action caused. Kisuk. Gray took one step towards his suddenly incapacitated ally when a large gust of wind slammed into him from that same direction, sending him flying backwards and into the far wall. Not so fast, Gremi spoke as he placed himself in between Gray and Kisuk, sparing one look at the body behind him before turning back to Gray. I'm quite curious. What did you do to that barrier? I only took note when I felt the connection threaten to collapse and had to intervene myself to save it. How did you avoid the countermeasures? Who said it was me? Gray bluffed, putting on the same fake smirk he used as Delira. Even he knew it wasn't fooling anyone though, the ice was a big giveaway, but he had to at least try while he attempted to work out what had happened to Kisuk. All of that had happened in the time it took to blink from his perspective. Gremi simply continued to smirk before he gestured at Gray to attack. Come on, let's see what you can do. I'm curious to see your limits. You are Gray Fullbuster of Fairy Tale, are you not? It would be helpful to know just how much stronger one becomes after being transformed into a demon, not that it will matter much in the end. I won't even need to lift a finger to fight you. Protector of the Fairies. Out of my way. Roared Kenpeka with glee as he smashed straight through the demons before him, purple lightning tearing apart everything in sight. Coating his body with the deadly energy he continued to charge straight through 5 more rows of enemies before shifting all the energy onto his right arm and swinging it forward. The energy tore forward like a beam into the charging crowds of demons, blowing them all away and leaving nothing but dust when he continued on his path. The demons couldn't stop him. No one could right now, not with how fast his blood was pumping. He hadn't been this excited in a long time. He hadn't been able to cut loose this much since he had fought Ichigo, able to utilize all his power in a fight against a foe he wasn't guaranteed to beat. Right now it was the same feeling as back then. Outnumbered hundreds to 1, having to fight through the crowds just to reach his target, and even then there was the magical power he could sense close by. It was massive, definitely matching the levels required to be one of Zeref's Devil Kings. Even his magic was getting excited by the demon's proximity, flaring up the closer he got as it begging to be unleashed to kill the demon. "Come on," he muttered gleeful to himself, pushing forward even faster as the magical power became nearer with every step. "Move faster. Hurry up. I can't wait much longer. Closer." He was so close now. He felt Yachiro leap from his shoulder as nearer, possibly going to find a good point to watch from, but he hardly paid her any heed. She would be fine on her own, even in a mess like this. Coating his body with magic once again, he took one massive leap into the air, turning into lightning part way and darting straight forward. Momentarily returning to normal in the sky, he spent just long enough to spot his destination before he changed again, the attacks from nearby demons all missing him as he shot straight forward towards the goal he had in his sights. Changing back to normal just as he slammed against the ground, he channeled all the excess energy from that spell into his fist and slammed it down against the ground. Every demon within 100 meters was immediately blown away as the lightning storm expanded out around him, leaving no safe from its grasp. Only one area weathered through it all, protected by a large cage of thorns. "There you are," Kenpeki stated, eyeing the demon before him like a hungry predator. "I've been waiting for this." Mardgeir glanced over from the book he was reading on his makeshift throne, the cage of thorns expanding out and revealing gaps to see within as he made to stand. "So Ishgar decided to send out their med dog, did they? Mardgeir doesn't see your leash anywhere. Seems they really have decided to allow you to run free today." "You bet they did," Kenpeki replied, not at all bothered by the insult. "You're the strongest here, I can sense it. All those small fries kept getting in my way, making it harder to get to you. I hope you'll prove to me that you were worth all the trouble." "Interesting. You have the nerve to imply that you are superior to Mardgeir. The nerve to speak as if this fight's victory has already been decided. But it is true that it has been decided. It's just that the victory will not belong to you." Thorns burst forth from the ground beneath Kenpeki's feet, attempting to skewer him on them in one swift move. For Kenpeki it was a simple matter to dart back as lightning and then destroy them all with a single swing of his lightning-coated fist. "Surprise attacks better not be all you're good at," Kenpeki said in disappointment. "I hope you last a while. Keep your guard up now. Here I come." In the time it took Mardgeir to blink, Kenpeki was before him, appearing as a flash of purple lightning that reformed right before him. It was all he could do to bring up his arms in time to block Kenpeki's fist, empowered by Devil Slayer magic, sending him flying back through the air far from where he was meant to be protecting. There was barely a moment's rest for Mardgeir when Kenpeki appeared right above him shortly after landing. The demon quickly realized that the Devil Slayer must have chased after him even as he had been sent flying and had little interest in going after the restored version of Hell's Core that he was trying to make. That suited his purposes fine if he was being honest. There was little chance of destroying it now, even if he used his full power. Rolling out of the way as the fist slammed down into the ground, the earth shattering as the lightning tore into it, Mardgeir snapped his fingers, the small action sending a barrage of large thorns charging out of the same weakened earth Kenpeki had just created. This time it was Kenpeki's turn to fly, sent upwards as the thorns continued to push against the lightning he released just in time. With just brief contact, the energy powering the small barrier continued to decrease until finally it was all gone, leaving Kenpeki with little choice but to move again before the thorns could do anything more than they already had. The moment he moved, Mardgeir snapped his fingers once again. The thorns that had been reaching upwards instantly changed direction, shooting off at right angles before being angled towards where Kenpeki was currently falling through in the air. Spotting the mass of thorns approaching from all sides from above, Kenpeki let his magic flow forth to both hands, lightning dancing across the surface of both as the energy intensified further. Sparks jumped from one hand to the other before they increased in scale too, resulting in a long connected beam of lightning between the two. With the thorns coming, he quickly raised both hands up, keeping them far apart from one another before firing. A massive wave of lightning tore forth from his hands, smashing into the majority of the thorns trying to kill him. A few still got through though, their directions correcting themselves at another snap of Mardgeir's fingers. Each was aimed at a vital point in Kenpeki's body, but not a single one of them managed to pierce his skin when lightning tore forth from all around him. Lightning Devil's Rage. Lightning tore down as Kenpeka turned his head towards Mardgear in midair, the massive torrent of Devil Slayer lightning impacting against the large shield formed from the thorns that broke out of the ground in front of Mardgear. One layer wasn't enough, Mardgear had already been aware of that. So instead there were multiple, each working to support the ones before and after it in an interlocking shield. Even with all that, the breath attack still broke halfway through the shield before all the energy contained within had either been used up or stolen through contact with the thorns. Not enough, Mardgear stated as Kenpeka came to land on the ground. With a wave of his hand the shield he had used turned into a weapon, the thorns on all the vines flying forward through the air as dangerous projectiles. Kenpeka quickly responded by slamming his foot into the ground, sending a wave of lightning forward to swat away any thorns that came too close for comfort. If this is the limit of your strength, then Mardgear truly had no reason to fear anything. If this is the limit of yours, then I'll be disappointed, Kenpeka responded, breaking into a run as he charged through the rest of the incoming projectiles. Most he dodged with ease, with some simply being swatted out of the way with brief bursts of lightning. You demons have an Aetherius form, right? Use it. You don't have the strength to make Mardgear use it, Mardgear replied as he shot forward, extending his palm forward as Kenpeka was about to reach him. From his palm this time sprouted much thinner but faster thorns, almost completely wrapping around Kenpeka's right arm before the Devil Slayer suddenly vanished in a burst of lightning. Appearing only a meter away to the side, Kenpeka rushed forward that extra few steps and slammed a fist right at Mardgear, just as the demon brought up a hand to block it. Catching the blow in his palm did little good for Mardgear, the result still sent him flying backwards, but he was only pushed back a few meters this time, most of the damage contained to his palm. Still not enough, Mardgear said in annoyance. Let me show you the true difference dash. Whatever he wanted to say was cut off when a purple blur slammed into him, knocking him off his feet and tearing off his right arm as it passed. Strength of will stopped Mardgear crying out in pain as he hit the ground, his head tilting back to see the being completely coated in purple lightning only a feet away, his missing arm held loosely in one of the monster's hands. Is this enough for you? The monster spoke. It took Mardgear a few moments to recognize the voice and realize exactly who he was facing. Or do you want me to kill you now instead? So this is what we heard rumors about, Mardgear growled out as he slowly got to his feet, still clutching his missing arm. From the ground thorns slowly extended up and attached themselves to the stump's surface, wrapping around each other and carefully shaping themselves until an arm of thorns stood in its place. A Devil Slayer's taint, as they call it. Their version of the drives of Dragon Slayers and manifestations of God Slayers. So you have heard some stuff, said Kenpeka as he turned to face Mardgear. Last chance. Otherwise this is going to be too boring to prolong. Mardgear hesitated for a second, his pride demanding him to avoid using his Aetherius form yet. But in the end self-preservation won out. Thorns burst out from the ground around him and wrapped around his body as his flesh began to change, his magical power skyrocketing in the process. Hidden within the cocoon of thorns his size increased, his skin darkening to a dark purple while his body's muscles grew to larger sizes. Dark horns grew from his forehead while his teeth sharpened, his ears meanwhile becoming elongated. From his back burst forth a pair of bat-like wings while feathers sprouted from his wrists and collar. All that remained of his old appearance was his long ponytail, hanging back still from the back of his head. His cocoon shattered the moment his wings stretched out, his strength allowing him to easily break free of the cocoon without any trouble. All the while Kenpeka continued to wait, the excitement the man felt visible in the way he could barely hold himself back. Now that's more like it, roared Kenpeka as he stopped restraining himself, dashing forward with the intention to steal Mardgear's arm again. He didn't expect for him to be the one sent flying in their exchange instead, Mardgear's fist slamming into his face suddenly the second he got close and knocking him right back to where he had started from. Mardgear won't fall for such blatant tricks a second time. I wouldn't expect you to. Let's enjoy this for as long as it lasts. Protector of the Fairies. Watch out. She's using Desh. Lalato wasn't able to finish her sentence as a streak of red shot out of the pillar of flames, her words getting loose in the pain she felt and the blood spilling from her mouth. The small blade of Karen's Bankai rested straight through her neck, flames burning the flesh around it as Lalato struggled to move. With the last strength she could draw on she tried to use the last bit of power she had, her mouth opening wide ready to try and swallow Karen whole, only for the rest of the flames around Karen to blast forward, leaving nothing but ashes in her place. Lalato. Anger took over for Candace, her body being enveloped in bright blue light as her Volstandig took form around her. 6 wings, shaped like lightning bolts, formed at her back while a crackling 5-pointed star of energy and lightning circling above her head. Not wanting to let her finish the transformation, Karen immediately swiped out at her, the flames around her blade being released in one massive swing. Getchuga Tenshao. The attack had only left the blade when Karen had to duck, a bolt of lightning tearing across the air above her. She realized a second too late that the bolt of lightning had been more than just an attack, Candace reforming right behind her with one of her 6 wings gripped in her right hand as a weapon. Die bitch! Rather than striking with the wing, Candace instead threw it, the lightning crossing the tiny distance between the two faster than Karen could blink. The second it hit, she was sent flying away as the energy exploded around her, consuming her in a storm of lightning that her flames struggled to hold back. Crashing through what she felt was a few walls, she was treated momentarily to a sight of the sky before a flash of lightning shot through the air above her. Prepared this time, she rolled out of the way across the ground she had temporarily come to rest on, another lightning wing slamming into the ground where she had been lying just a second ago. Okay, she muttered to herself. She's fast. Fast might have been an understatement, she admitted. She could only keep track of her because of the enhanced speed she was getting from Shengkao on top of her Bankai. Without Shengkao, she was sure she would only see the flashes as Candace shot past. That might become the reality of the situation though in a minute or two. Protecting herself from the lightning storm had meant drawing her flames closer to her body. That also meant drawing her Shengkao's flames closer to her body too. Pain had begun to set it, and, loath as she was to admit it, she would not be able to last too long with this pain. If she did manage by any stroke of luck, she might end up burnt alive as a result of her own magic. The chains on her legs loosened as she prepared her next move, Candace rushing at her with a wing now grasped in both hands. Her small blade quickly came up to deflect one into the other, slipping past and spinning in an attempt to gain an opening to strike at Candace's back. The flash of lightning she saw, however, told her it was already too late, her eyes tracking the lightning as it shot back a few meters and reformed into Candace herself. First she had to seal Candace's movements. She knew the weaknesses of elemental forms. She had dealt with them in the past. Just not one this fast. If she could just restrain Candace for a moment, she would have time to unleash an attack strong enough to finish her off. How she would do that though would be tricky, she thought before her eyes widening at the sight of Candace bringing one of her wings in a throwing motion. Wasting no time, she rushed directly at Candace, forcing the Quincy to rush her throw in the face of the approaching danger. It made it far easier for her dodge, avoiding the tip of the weapon by a hair's breadth as she rushed straight towards her target. As she closed in, she lunged, jumping slightly as she rushed through the air with her blade being thrust forward. Candace dodged, exactly as she thought she would. Her attack had been so easy to avoid when she had basically thrown herself at the enemy. She saw Candace bringing the other wing she still held down just as she was about to hit the ground, and that was when she acted, her free hand pressing against the earth as her chains broke free from their bindings completely. Using the contact, she spun her body round from that point, the chains whipping out at Candace and wrapping around her right arm and weapon right before it could make contact with her chest. Flames burst to life all along the surface of the chains, and she heard Candace let out a brief scream of pain as she tried to pull her arm free. And when she couldn't, she tried to blow them away by detonating her lightning wing still trapped in the chains. Karen didn't let the chains loosen, even though she was so close to the blast. There was no avoiding the damage here, but this was the best chance she had right now at dealing a crippling blow. So she weathered through the storm of lightning as her flames clung closely to her, ignoring the burning pain from her back and arms as her Shengkao continued to harm her. Still balancing on one hand, her legs stuck in the position they were in to keep Candace restrained, she aimed her blade up at the Quincy as the flames began to wrap around the blade. Dare Psycha! The cyclone of flames burst forward as Karen thrusted the sword upwards, launching straight through the remains of the lightning storm and slamming into where the Quincy was. Or at least it was meant to. The attack pushed off to one side as she felt her grip slip as the tension linked to her legs vanished. Crashing roughly on the ground, trying to ignore the pain from her burns, She glanced down at her feet and chains only to find they were still tightly bound around something. The only difference was that what they were tied around was not bound to anything. Candace's arm still gripped tightly and nothing else. Instincts screamed at her to dodge, and they were barely enough to help her avoid the strike aimed at her head, her chains rapidly loosening and retracting back to around her legs as she struggled to her feet. Candace didn't stop to give her time to recover, lashing out with her lightning wing once again in a fast series of strikes. Even so, it wasn't a practical melee weapon, Karen noted. Unlike her sword, a weapon perfectly designed for her to utilize, Candace's weapon was larger in an unwieldy shape, unsuitable for the way she was trying to use it. That, combined with the unrestrained fury that stretched across Candace's face, was all that helped her predict the fast Quincy's movements as the Quincy pushed her body even further than before, transforming between lightning and human constantly in an effort to land a strike faster. However, despite Candace's efforts, even she could see her strikes weren't going to land. She had sliced off her arm in order to break free of the chains, the flames that coated them capable of burning it away even if she did turn to lightning. And now she was hampered by the fact she only had one arm to fight with. She couldn't even fire a bow like this and was reduced to striking around like a maniac, with only 3 of her wings left. Given time she could reform them, but it was a tedious process that required her to focus and gather magic from her surroundings, a process she could not do while the Shinigami before her lived. She had to end this quickly. Halting in her assault, she darted backwards as lightning, reforming in the air as she came to a stop and watched Karen from above. "I'm done playing with you, little bitch. I'm going to leaving nothing but scraps of you and show them to your boyfriend before we kill him. Like I'll let you." Karen began to leap upwards only for Candace's wing weapon to be flung at her, forcing her to swipe up with her blade while she still could. Burka. A wall of flames shot up with her blade as she swiped upwards, the lightning weapon crashing and exploding against them before it could reach her. The attack cost her precious seconds though, and when the flames parted for her she was greeted by the sight of Candace aiming her soul arm up at the sky, lightning circling the whole limb. Her remaining 2 wings had left her back and now hovered around her arm, the lightning from her limb bouncing between them and back as the magical power in the area continued to grow. Before she could try and act, a pillar of lightning tore down from the sky, slamming into Candace and the area all around her. "I'll finish this," Candace stated as the immense energy began to condense down and coat her arm, contained within the 2 wings. The remaining lightning leaked out across her shoulder and up to her face, flickering around her eyes as she brought her arm down to point at Karen. "Electrocution. Der Psyche!" Karen screamed back as she thrusted her sword forward, diverting all the flames around her body to her right arm and blade to funnel them all forward. She could feel the process leaving deeper burn marks across her back as she rushed to get the flames to their destination as fast as possible, a torrent of flames being released just in time as a massive beam of lightning tore out from Candace's hand. All the flames managed to do was halt the blast for a few moments. As much as Karen tried to push back at the blast, she could feel her magic giving way to the force from above. Der Psyche was one of her strongest attacks and was the most focused she could make her flames like this, but it suffered from the same problem a lot of her attacks did, too focused on widespread damage than the precise focused strike she was facing now. One would always give to the other, and right now it was her magic giving in. "Not yet," she muttered, the chains of her feet coming loose as she tried to plan. Her attack would break in a few more moments. She had only that much time to dodge in or she'd die, even with the additional power from her Shunkao over her Bankai. However, if her flames dropped now, then the lightning would tear down at her before she would get a chance to make it out of the blast zone. Avoiding the attack completely was impossible, but if she could at least make some distance between self and the origin, then she would be able to survive. Pivoting on one leg, she snapped out with her other, the chains around it extending out and wrapping around a nearby support column near an opening back inside. The moment the chain was wrapped around it tightly, she reeled herself in. The sudden force made her feel like her leg had been pulled from its socket, her sword barely kept up towards the lightning as she was pulled away from where she was standing. What little remained of the flames continued to hold the strike at bay for just a bit longer before it finally broke apart before the intense lightning storm, the blast slamming against the ground where she had been standing and extending outwards. She wasn't even halfway to her destination when the lightning caught up with her, sending her flying and slamming against the nearby wall closest to her chains. She was alive, she noted. That didn't feel like much of a relief though when she couldn't even move her body, lightning continuing to spark across her as she tried to get up. It was paralyzing her, interfering with any of her attempts to try and launch a counter-attack. "So you survived," Candace spoke as she appeared before her, landing on the ground by her feet. Candace took one look at her before letting out a harsh laugh, gesturing at her with her one hand. "You're a real mess, you should really see yourself. Did you cause those burns yourself? What kind of bankai burns its user?" Karen wanted to swear at her, but even words weren't able to be spoken with her body paralyzed like this. Her bankai was still clinging to her, but her shunkao was gone, the focus needed for maintaining it shattered. And that meant her body wasn't hidden as well by the flames anymore. Raw flesh was exposed with dripping blood in the areas least affected, while her back had large patches turned black, the smell hitting her as she tried to distract her mind from it. The flames must have burnt the flesh away so much that they cauterized the wounds. "Looks like even if you survived my attack, you can't even move. Makes this easier." Reaching up to the five-pointed star above her head, Candace gripped it by the edge before removing it and holding it to one side. "This'll make as good a weapon as any. This is for Lalato. Don't do this, Candace." Candace paused at the new voice, Karen's eyes widening in shock at the figure that had appeared behind Candace. "She's my family." "Well, looks like Sleeping Beauty showed up," snarled Candace as she glared daggers at Yuzu. "She killed Lalato. There's no way I'm letting her live, no matter what you say. I'm warning you, Dash." "Oh, you're warning me, are you?" Candace laughed, turning away from Karen and pointing the star at Yuzu. "You? His Majesty has high expectations for you, but I think you're far from meeting them. All you've done here for a month is training that stupid script of yours. What does it do? Contact the dead? No matter how much you learned, you really think you can stop me killing her? One last chance, Candace." "Oh, this will be good," shot back Candace as she took a step towards Yuzu. "Go on then. Give me your best shot. I'll promise not to hurt you too badly for getting in my way. Can't have His Majesty on my back for killing you. So you won't back down." Yuzu sighed sadly. "I tried. Goodbye, Candace." "Goodbye? You have some nerve." Pulling her arm back, she threw the star forward at Yuzu, the lightning around it exploding off just as it was about to reach her. However, right before it could hit Yuzu, she reached out with one hand and grabbed the star, a complex bright pattern of blue light across the surface of her skin. Stepping back in fear at the sight of not a single bit of damage to Yuzu's palm, a bead of sweat slowly began to trickle down Candace's head as she stared at the sight. How? Pain erupted from her back before she could think on it anymore, her head looking down to see the end of a small black blade sticking out from her chest. The Shinigami. The paralysis must have worn off when she was distracted with Yuzu. She tried to summon any last bits of lightning, but they all slipped from her grasp as her Volstandig disappeared, her body crashing to the ground as Karen drew her blade back. "No one harms my sister," Karen snarled out before her Bankai slowly began to fade around her. As it vanished, she fell to her knees, the sealed form of her Zanpakuta digging into the ground as she tried to support herself with it. Small sparks of lightning continued to dance along her major limbs, still restricting her movements somewhat. She had to be thankful to Yuzu that she had shown up when she had. She had only gotten this chance because Candace had been so distracted when the paralysis had weakened. Speaking of which. Why Yuzu you? She let out a big smile as her sister approached her, pure relief in her voice at seeing Yuzu perfectly unharmed. "I was so worried. They didn't do anything to you, right?" Yuzu shook her head. "What about you, Karen? You must have been through quite a lot." Karen tried to shake her head but only managed to turn it part way before she winced from the pain. "I'll live. May need a bit, no, a lot of first aid. But I'll live. I'm just so happy to see you're fine. If they had hurt you in any way, Dash." A pair of arms wrapping around her silenced her words, Yuzu resting her head against her own in comfort. "You don't have to worry anymore, Karen. Everything will be fine now." The smile on Karen's face slowly settled down into a content one, enjoying the feeling she got from her sister's presence. "I know it will. Dad will be so happy to know you're safe. We need to regroup with the others, Dash." "We can do that in a bit," Yuzu said, cutting her off. I just have to say that I'm so sorry you've had to suffer for so long, Karen. It's only been a month. Besides, it could have been longer. No, Karen. That's not what I meant. I meant that it must have been so hard for you to suffer for all these years without me. And look at you now. All grown up. Without you. Karen frowned in confusion. Yuzo, you've been by my side for years. What are you talking about? I'm sorry, Karen. But don't worry. Everything is fine now. I'll make sure you're safe and I'll go kill those that will ruin the peace His Majesty plans to bring. Yuzo. New pain slammed into Karen's back like a sledgehammer, her eyes rolling back as her consciousness blacked out. Yuzo could only sigh as she laid Karen down against the ground, a regretful look on her face as she turned towards the hole a white-haired Shinigami was exiting from. I know who you are, Yuzo said as she greeted Toshiro. You're her boyfriend, right? I can't believe she's already at that age. I wonder how His Highness is handling that. He always seemed to say that he'd never let any boy date his precious little girls. You're not Yuzo, Toshiro stated simply, his sword drawn and pointed at her. Are you an enemy? It appears you finished off Menina's too, Yuzo continued to speak, ignoring Toshiro's accusation. Though not without injury, she noted at the sight that Toshiro was only holding his blade with his right hand, his other hanging loosely by his side encased in a cast of ice. Menina's was always a bit too strong for her own good. I hope she wasn't too rough on you. Karen would get very sad, I feel, if you died. I don't care about that, Toshiro snarled. Get away from Karen and tell me who you are. Because Yuzo wouldn't have harmed Karen under any circumstances. I am Yuzo, Yuzo replied, placing a hand against her chest. However, I suppose that is being very technical. This body is definitely that of Yuzo's, but my precious little girl is sleeping right now. She's very tired and so I'm going to handle things for her for a while. Her power, Toshiro muttered. You're whatever she summoned up. Who are you really? Or who were you once? Well, that is easy to answer, Yuzo replied. Because there is no one more willing to help Karen here than the one who cares for her more than anyone else in the world. Your name? Masaki, Yuzo replied, giving Toshiro a soft smile that didn't resemble the feeling it should be giving as she formed and raised a bow at him. Masaki Kurosaki. Protector of the fairies. For the sake of my precious student. For any demon nearby, approaching the two clashing was the same as suicide. Even at their distance, many were still dragged into the conflict through no fault of their own. Mardgear and Kenpeka simply cared little at how far their attacks spread or who was being caught in them. Fields of thorns, connected through branches as thick as tree trunks, covered the whole area while storms of lightning rained down every time Kenpeka struck towards Mardgear. Neither was holding anything back nor caring for the destructive caused around them. Both only sought one thing, and that was the death of the other. Flicking his wrist as he flew underneath some of his giant thorns, Mardgear poured his magic into the nearest pieces of vegetation and modified their growth. From the ground burst new flowers, giant in scale and all glowing a bright red from their petals. Kenpeka merely scoffed, however, as he fell towards them, turning to lightning and darting straight down to the ground just before they could explode and catch him in the blast. Turning back to normal and rolling as he hit the ground, he opened his mouth wide as he turned his head back up towards Mardgear's retreating form. Lightning Devil's Rage. Looking over his shoulder in time to see the cyclone of lightning approaching him, Mardgear spun round and raised his palm towards the attack, thorns shooting out from the skin and extending out before him into a large shield 5 times thicker than his body. Even that didn't hold up for long, the Devil Slayer magic Kenpeka used easily overpowering his own magic. However, it was enough of a pause to give him time to move, kicking off his own shield for some extra force as he flew upwards. With a downward swipe of his arm, more thorns, thinner and smaller than the ones surrounding them all, burst out from the ground all around Kenpeka, firing straight at the Devil Slayer in order to take the shortest path to their target. All it took was for Kenpeka to slam his foot against the ground as they approached to destroy them, lightning expelling off from his lightning cloak and tearing the thorns to pieces. The smaller thorns may have been far faster, but they paid for that speed and strength, unable to even hope to resist the kind of power Kenpeka was throwing around in his lightning taint. Mardgear didn't want to admit it. It would even be more accurate to say that he was loath to admit it. but the facts before him told him everything he needed to know. He was outmatched. Not even his own pride could ignore that fact when faced against someone even the humans considered a monster. There were few who could overpower him like this, and none of them had ever been normal living humans like this man was. Not even Kenpeka's Devil Slayer magic would have covered this all alone. The man was simply too powerful. However, in a lot of ways that actually filled him with confidence. When all was said and done, the man before him had few secrets or tricks that he kept hidden. Everything the Devil Slayer used or kept hidden was about increasing the power he emitted, the only exception being the curse used in the magic. He could feel the first signs of its presence though, faint flickers of purple lightning flickering across his own form every once in a while. Glancing briefly at his left arm, he noticed how it was half a second slow to react when he tried to move it. The effects were getting worse with every clash. Every time he took a hit, his body began to respond slower than before. Right now he could still maintain this pace, but it wouldn't take long for the effects to become more severe, and if his reaction speed slowed down much further then he would be unable to counter Kenpeka's attacks. It was only his Aetherius form that had allowed him to last this long, his skin specially designed by Zeref to resist the effects of any attacks that struck at him. A lesser demon would have already succumbed after just 5 hits. Even with the danger though, he was confident that he could win if he kept this up. Subtly glancing to the right, he eyed the large site close by. It was a tree, giant in scale and growing larger with every passing second. If he was to compare it to anything, then the best comparison would be the great Tenro tree he had heard rumors about on Tenro Island. The effects of the two trees was nowhere near the same, but if he could buy enough time then he would win. He just had to make sure he could survive that long. His gaze returned to Kenpeka just in time to see the Devil Slayer launch up from the ground, turning to lightning mid-flight and accelerating to tremendous speeds. However, seeing that technique enough times told him all he needed to know about it. While incredibly fast, its path were absolute as a result. Straight lines, every single time, and never for very long. At short range it was incredibly fearsome, but at further ranges there were more options available to him. All he had to do was move to the side quickly enough and he would be out of striking range. Of course that didn't just make him safe because he had dodged. Kenpeka appeared in the air only a meter away and slightly above him. He prepared for the following attempt at striking, only for Kenpeka to vanish, the only sight shown being the flickering of lightning upwards. Frowning, he turned his gaze upwards just in time to see a new blur of lightning slamming down at him. His arms barely came up in time as Kenpeka reformed, his lightning-coated fist slamming down against him and knocking him from the sky. Lightning Devil's crushing step. Kenpeka chuckled as his foe shot down through the sky, leaving a large crater in the ground as the demon made contact. His amusement didn't fade in the slightest when, from the smoke and dust, large thorns shot up from the ground and tried to crush him as they all slammed together. It was an amusing attempt, but he didn't even feel worried about such a strike. Instead he dove down straight into the mix, letting the lightning around his right fist intensify as he dove for the central point they were joining at. Lightning Devil's obliterating fist. Everything in his path found itself blown away as the energy detonating, tearing open a large hole for him to continue to fall through. Mardgeir was waiting for him as he hit the ground, lashing out with a swipe of his claws with a strike intending to take his head off. Turning to lightning right before it could reach, he moved just a few steps back and reformed, his arm held over his shoulder as the lightning surrounding it extended forward from his hand like a blade. Lightning Devil's sword. He couldn't stop smiling as he swung his arm down, the blade nearly catching Mardgeir and only falling short due to the thorns that shot up and halted his blade for a split second. He was having the time of his life and not even a slight setback like that could stop him. Rushing forward, he continued to swing out, forming another blade of lightning around his other hand as he continued to hack and slash his way through any thorns that even dared to get close. The delay had been enough time for Mardgeir to take back to the air though, the one place where he held dominance. It was a real shame he couldn't do the same as Laxus in times like this. Envy was not an emotion he usually felt about someone unless it was about missing out on a good fight. His lightning form's instant transformations and movements was good for speed, but he couldn't simply stay in the form and choose where he wanted to go while waiting in the form. He couldn't dart around the sky unless he changed back to normal briefly in between jumps. Even that slight bit of envy wasn't enough to put a downer on his mood though. Even if he couldn't maintain his position up there like Mardgeir could, it took barely any time to catch up to him no matter how high the demon tried to fly. And if it did get annoying, then he could simply tear the wings from the demon's back and force him to fight on the ground like him. Readying both lightning blades, he instantly transformed and shot upwards. This time, however, Mardgeir didn't even try to dodge. He instead made sure he was directly in Kenpeke's path, his hands reaching out just as Kenpeke reformed and tried to strike in order to grasp both limbs with a tight grip. Mardgeir's strength was almost not enough, but in the end the blades did halt, only millimeters away from his sides. "Bad choice, demon," Kenpeke stated arrogantly, the lightning around his arms intensifying and scraping across Mardgeir's sides. "You can't dodge now." "Strange." Mardgeir would say the same. A brief flicker of pain hit Kenpeke at the area where his arms were being gripped. The next the lightning around the two limbs dispersed, thorns extending out from the surface of his skin as pain began to continue up towards the rest of his body. Kenpeke's smile never died, even though the pain. In a show of power he ripped his arms free, the lightning around his limbs reforming as the rest of his cloak intensified to 2 times his size. Such an act was a massive waste of magic to anyone watching, but it was more than worth it to Kenpeke. The action had not only broken him free but had pushed his curse into overdrive and torn into the thorns attacking him from the inside. He didn't miss the surprised look on the demon's face either, grabbing the demon by his arm and swinging him down with all the strength he could muster. The show of force wasn't quite the same as when he had done it last, Mardgeir managing to catch himself with his wings a few meters from the ground, but it mattered little when he landed right next to the demon, swinging his arm out with lightning flying from his skin. Lightning Devil's vicious swipe. Waves of lightning tore into Mardgeir, the demon finally letting out a cry of pain as he was knocking away and hit the ground once again. Instantly rolling as he hit the earth, Mardgeir slammed a fist against the ground and halted his momentum. When he tried to stand, however, he was met by the same result. He couldn't move. While he couldn't turn his head down to look, his eyes could still see the flickering purple lightning out of the corner of his eye. No matter much he wanted to, he couldn't move. And it was all because of Kenpeke's curse. So it finally happened, Kenpeke muttered, traces of disappointment creeping into his voice. Just when I was really getting into it. I was hoping this could have lasted forever. I had hoped you could resist it like Ichigo could. But I guess I was wrong. Sighing, Kenpeke took a brief glance all around him, pausing for a few moments to take in the sight of their battle. We really had a lot of fun, didn't we? He mused, seeing nothing but the dense maze of thorns all around them. If only you could have lasted a bit longer. What the hell? Kenpeke's eyes narrowed as he took note of the sudden appearing of floating pink petals nearby, far too close for his liking. What's the big deal, Byakuya? This is my fight. Well, it hardly seems like a fight anymore, does it? Byakuya answered in annoyance, his voice coming from behind Kenpeke. The Devil Slayer spared a glance over his shoulder, watching as the general took a step off the air and onto the ground, before turning back to Mardgeir. I'm finishing this. I don't like others interfering in my battles, especially if they intend to just steal the kill from it. Oh, don't worry about me ruining your fun, Byakuya replied coldly. I have my own problems. Mardgeir. And there's my problem. Byakuya didn't have to say more than that for Kenpeke to turn his focus towards the newcomer. If it hadn't been obvious enough with her appearance, then her magic would have confirmed that she was a demon. As it was, one of the demon's golden horns had been severed near the base while the kimono she wore was ripped in many places. This demon. Kenpeke scoffed as he sensed the levels of magical power coming from the demon. She's definitely strong, but she's nothing compared to her boss on the floor. Want me to take both of them on? It might help me get a bit more enjoyment before his fight truly ends. Don't underestimate her. Her ability allows her to control things. She turned the whole battlefield against me when we fought, along with most of my own men. I had to flee over here with her in pursuit to get her to release them. That just makes her even weaker if she needs others to fight her battles. Give me a moment. I'll finish this all in one blow. The lightning around Kenpeke's arm intensified once again before the new lightning stretched up around the rest of his form, covering himself in the 2 layers of lightning. Devil Slayer's secret art. Stop him! Mardgeir shouted, the new arrival waving her hand towards her leader and saying one word. Move. Suddenly it was like the lightning holding Mardgeir didn't exist. He didn't waste a single second as he rushed forward, his wings beating as fast as he could to close the gap. The female demon was right behind him, uttering a few words Kanpeka couldn't quite make out at this distance. Not that it mattered. They wouldn't reach him in time. Encroaching wraith. He roared out as his smile returned, happy to finish the fight like this. Consuming blade dash, he found himself unable to finish when pain erupted through his body. Both demons before him came to a stop, still a good distance away, and watched as the lightning around his body flickered for a few moments before finally dispersing all around him. He fought to keep it up, knowing he still had plenty of magic to spare, and yet his will kept losing. His gaze finally dropped down to see the source of the pain, a sword sticking out straight through his chest and through his heart. "I tried to warn you," he heard Byakuya say, the man's voice right behind him now and filled with only one emotion he never expected to hear from the prideful man. Despair. She can control people. Why did you have to assume I was an exception, you fool? The blade was withdrawn and, like a puppet with its strings cut, Kanpeka collapsed, falling against the ground without a single show of resistance. His eyes struggled to stay open as he came to a realization that shocked him more than anything else. He was dying. Protector of the fairies. Did you sense that, Ishain? Ishain shrugged. Not sure what you mean, Ryukin. You really think I noticed such a thing? My sensing abilities aren't as nearly good as yours. Then you're a fool to not train them more, Ryukin replied, fiddling with the medallion he had picked up from the corpse at his feet. Kanpeka's Araki is dying. That made Ishain pause, recovering just in time to avoid the strike of sword and to deal the final blow to his enemy. You're kidding, right? That monster. I would have thought dying was an impossible concept for him. We should be more worried about who managed to kill him. And with him dead, the demons may gain more incentive to push their luck. Don't underestimate the amount of power he accounted for in the East. Hey, I'm not doing that, Ishain countered quickly. I'm a general, I know stuff like this. It's part of my responsibilities and I think I fulfill them quite well. Then why did you agree so readily to come to this battlefield with me, at the furthest point away from where you are meant to be? Ishain turned to glare at Ryukin. You know why. Now are you done over there or not? Almost. I'll take a bit longer, I'm afraid. This tech is meant to only work for the chosen. I'm just having to see if I can adjust what parameters it uses to determine that. You won't be able to, the man at his feet groaned out. And even if you do, you'll die the moment you dash. He was cut off by an arrow to the head before he could finish speaking, Ryukin lowering his bow back down and letting it fade away as he returned to work. You know, for someone who hates magic, Ishain commented, you're surprisingly good at it. I just find there are better ways to live in this world than with magic. And as unfortunate as it may be, no one can destroy talent. It was my duty to cultivate such talent even if I didn't desire it for the sake of the future. Ishain shrugged. Whatever you say. Just hurry up, will you? This place is giving me the creeps. Why? There's no one here. It's exactly that reason that I'm wary. Because if your suspicions on all this are right, we all should be. Protector of the fairies. I'm sorry for the delay in reaching you, Mardgeir. This man's will was strong. It took physical contact for me to implant the energy from my curse directly into him. He was able to resist up till that point. Mardgeir leaned in closer towards Byakuya, glancing at him curiously. Mardgeir wonders why. Few have such unshakable resolve to ignore your commands. He would have had to reject what you wanted to do with every fiber of his being with not the slightest spark of consideration to what you wanted. Either way, you did a good job, Sela. Hopefully Master Zeref will be proud of such actions. Your words are too kind. Would you mind if I keep him as a toy? His strength is quite impressive. Mardgeir thinks not, Mardgeir said, rejecting the proposal within a heartbeat. This mage was capable of resisting your commands at first. He also was trying to warn the Devil Slayer of the threat you posed. Despite that, I'm sure you tried to cover all bases in making sure he was ordered to not reveal that he was being controlled. If he could find a loophole once, he'll find it again. I can always put him back under new commands if he tries to exploit some. And he'll continue to do the same. And who is to say he won't break free entirely and become immune to your curse? Mardgeir shook his head in disappointment. No, I'm afraid his usefulness as a tool is limited for us. Set him loose on Ishgar's forces and then kill him the second his actions seem to hint at him gaining resistance. If he's still alive by the end of the day, we'll dispose of him permanently then. If that is your wish, I shall listen. Mardgeir nodded. Very good. Now we have the other matter. He turned his head towards the body of Kenpeki at his feet, frowning ever so slightly at the sight of it. Mardgeir is impressed. You still live even after taking such a strike. Your strength of will is very different from this man over here, but it is far more ferocious in its desire to cling to life. Or is it battle you cling to? It matters little to Mardgeir. Your death is absolute. But let us speed it up. Raising one hand, Mardgeir summoned up thorns all around Kenpeki's body. Don't expect any mercy from Mardgeir, even in death. Monsters like you need this much for those who fight you to be sure you're dead. Swinging his hand down, all the thorns stabbed straight at Kenpeki. That was until they were all swatted out of the way as a blur shot into their midst. An additional sweeping force caused Mardgeir and the others to immediately leap back, cautious of the sudden appearance of a new threat. What they didn't expect to see was a small girl with pink hair, crouched down beside Kenpeki's body. Hello Kenny. Protector of the fairies. Where was he? He didn't know. It felt like he was sinking into an ocean, unable to put up a fight. He was fighting, wasn't he? Oh yeah. He was dying. Kenpeki would have laughed if he could have, and yet he couldn't find the energy. It was odd. He never expected this to ever feel so peaceful. It was like he was merely floating away from life, without pain as he faded away. He could go without a word if he wished. He supposed this was when people pondered their choices in life. When they wondered if it had all been worth it, and when they contemplated on the decisions they regretted. Except he could find little to regret. He had been happy. Sure, he had been bored a lot of the time, few could ever challenge him in battle, but he had enjoyed fighting even for the brief time a match would last. It had given him something that nothing else could replicate. And those few times where he was truly challenged, and sometimes was even surpassed entirely, they had filled him with so much joy that he doubted he could properly convey it in words. Maybe that was one regret then. That those battles had to come to an end. The fights he had enjoyed the most had always been the ones where he had been outmatched, and yet he had always regretted the way they had ended. The first to beat him like that had been her, the one who had gifted him his magic after deciding to spare his life despite him not caring for it. He had wished that he could have been treated as an equal in that fight, but he had never gotten it. And then there was his fight with Ichigo, where not once did he ever manage to get him to use his Bankai. How much fun would such a fight have been? Would he have even stood a chance in the first place? But he supposed his biggest regret right now was this fight. Was this really how it was ending? Stabbed in the back by a mind-controlled ally? Was that really how he was going to die? Not in battle, not against a strong and worth opponent, but by a sneak attack from such despicable actions? He didn't want to die. Not yet. Hello Kenny. He knew that voice. It was like the whole space he was in vanished as his eyes fought once more to see the world, barely managing to focus on the girl in front of him. Yeah, Chiro. You're dying Kenny, he heard her say sadly. He wanted to laugh, to shake off her fears, but it took all his will to keep his vision clear on her. Why are you dying like this? What did she want? He knew this wasn't how he wanted to go out. But his strength was all but gone. In another minute he might not be able to see her, and when that happened he would be completely gone. If he could. What would you do if you could? Yachiru asked him, her head tilted curiously with a smile as she read his thoughts clearly. She always had known him that well. I don't even need an answer to that. You'd fight. Fight until you die in a way you can accept. Fight so you don't die like this. That was right. There was no fun in a battle that ended like this. Live or die, he wanted to enjoy a fight to its fullest. If he died because his effort wasn't enough, that was fine with him. So long as he could seek out that final battle with both hands. Is that truly what you want, Kenny? He heard her ask him softly, her smile never dying. Silly question. Of course it is. You've always been the same, all these years I've known you for. Hey you pest. Get away from him. He tried to warn Yachiru of the threat from the female demon behind her, desperately trying to force his mouth to scream the warning out in time, but there was no need. Just as Sila's fist came down at Yachiru's head did a sudden invisible force smash against her, knocking her back and filled with shock at what had happened. I'll grant you your wish, Kenny. There was only one I couldn't grant you and I'm sorry about that. I hope you'll forgive me. Her hand came down to rest against his head before her whole body was covered in a dense aura of magic. He was sure everyone within 5 miles could sense the magical power she was giving off, a magical power far larger than what should be contained within a normal little girl. Anyone looking at her and sensing this power would have also recognized how far from human this magic was too. But for him, he only saw the same smile she had given him when she told him all those years ago that she would help him find the world he was always looking for. Goodbye, Kenny. Remember, I'll always love you. Because you are my one and only precious student and son. Protector of the fairies. What the hell's going on? Sela demanded as she turned towards Mardgear. Mardgear. Mardgear didn't respond to her, too caught up in the sight before him. From the shadow of the pink-haired girl he could see something clawing its way out. From the girl's hair he could see something stretching out and expanding, taking a form even larger than the girl herself. If he had to describe it, he would compare it to a giant furry hamster with pink fur. In the time it took to fully form, the being in the shadows had finally clawed its way out, standing at twice the height of the girl and cloaked in black rags. That didn't stop him seeing its arms of bone nor the skeleton body visible at different areas. I never thought I would see this again. Not after you went in hiding years ago. Mardgear? What is she? She's a devil, Mardgear replied. One of the original's few that still live. At her prime her strength was comparable to ours. And interesting enough, she was the devil that governed lightning. Lightning? Sela frowned, glancing at the creatures beside Yachiru. Then what are those things? Aiming her magic at the beings, she gave them a single order to leave. To her surprise, they didn't obey. That won't work, Mardgear stated. Those aren't living beings but entities she is manipulating through her curse. You could say they are pieces of her original form, modified and animated by using lightning as a replacement for their nervous systems. Any messages to their bodies are sent through her lightning and even that is linked to her own reactions. There's no delay in her commanding them because they function as she does. Your curse may be able to take control normally but in a case like this you are trying to tell them something they physically cannot do. Turning his full attention back to Yachiru, he gave a brief nod in admiration towards her. Mardgear acknowledges your strength. Even diminished, it is more than enough to fight against a member of the 9 demon gates such as Sela here. However, looking at your form, Mardgear wonders if you can even maintain your powers for long. This is not the form you took so long ago. I'm amazed you remember me, Underworld King, Yachiru spoke, sending a glare towards Mardgear that was mirrored by the 2 constructs around her. Was it because I refused to join you and you couldn't kill me when that happened? You impressed Master Zeraf enough to have him leave you alone in peace, Mardgear replied. Even he respected the prowess of Yachiru Anohana, the devil who spilt more human blood than any other. It's Yachiru Kuzajishi now, Yachiru stated. Kenny gave me a new name when I took on this form. He didn't realize at first that I was the same person who taught him. And I never really noticed when he did make the connection either. I suppose he realized I didn't act like a normal child or that I never aged normally unless I wished to. So that was the odd feeling Mardgear got from his magic. His curse was different in a lot of ways from your own but Mardgear still should have noticed the similarities in the feeling of the energy. Mardgear just never assumed a devil such as yourself would teach a human the magic to kill our kind. It surprises Mardgear even more so that you loved him enough to consider him your son. He fascinated me, Yachiru merely replied. Such an odd human. I found him on a mountain of bandit corpses near my home. And then he attacked me, without fear of the vast differences between our levels of magical power. I spared him and trained him. But you did far more than that, Mardgear added, gesturing at her body. Look at yourself. Power like yours doesn't just vanish. You didn't just gift him Devil Slayer magic. You gifted him your own strength. No wonder no human can match his levels of magical power. You made him impossible to be matched. You never just intended for him to fight human opponents, did you? He wanted to fight strong opponents, Yachiro stated. So I allowed him that chance. If he had a wish, I tried to grant it. There was only one I couldn't grant though when he asked for it. Her eyes dropped down towards Kenpeka before giving him a smile. Wait a moment, Kenny. I'll be back. Don't tell Mardgear that you intend to challenge him with such weakened power. Mardgear asked in disbelief. Even you should not be so foolish. Sela. Remove your Limiter and crush her. Yes, Mardgear. Placing her hand against her chest, she willed her magic to act upon herself. I order myself to remove my Limiter. With each word her magical power grew, her skin darkening before her body completely changed. Her top vanished completely, only the sleeves of the kimono remaining, while tattoos crossed over her exposed chest, beginning from the choker at her neck, and formed the symbol of her guild's mark over her stomach. Her horns increased in size, the broken horn even repairing in the process, while her legs had narrowed into slits with a wing on each extending out. I don't remember fighting her, Yachiro commented as she began hopping from one foot to the other as she neared Sela. Zeref must have made her after you attacked me. He never did seem satisfied with any of the ones he made. I bet even you are a disappointment to him. Do not speak to Mardgear like that. Screamed Sela as she shot forward, leaving the ground where she had been standing crushed. Yachiro simply waited a moment as a small amount of lightning began to coat her hand and extend like a blade, the action being shared by the two beings surrounding her. Sela was about to strike her when Yachiro swung down, far too early actually hit Sela. That was what the demon had believed. So when she was suddenly hit by a blade of lightning before Yachiro had even finished her swing, so couldn't hide her disbelief before she was slammed straight down into the ground. Silly girl. You can't hit me like that. What had happened? Sela glanced up to see Yachiro doing a few hops and jumps as she waited for her to get back up, the actions mirrored by the beings beside her. Wait a minute. That wasn't true. The beings weren't quite mirroring Yachiro, but rather they were performing the actions at different moments. The pink fur entity was doing them even before Yachiro did, while the giant skeleton followed up after Yachiro herself. Told you, Yachiro stated as she pointed at her, the beings around her doing the same. You can't hit me like that. It's so annoying when you miss a strike after putting so much effort into it. So I developed this technique so I wouldn't have to be annoyed. 3 strikes, each at different times. Anyone who tries to fight someone has to learn their timings. They use that to learn how to dodge their strikes, how to time their counterattacks, and how to know how fast an attack might reach them. No matter how hard you try to fight me, you are going to really struggle to deal with all that when I'm attacking you at 3 moments in time each time. Is that so? Then I should thank you for telling me that. Darting back, Sela raised her palm, revealing a closed eye in the center of it. The eye snapped open at the same moment. Circles of runes formed around the eye, a dense aura of energy covering the whole area. I'll just blow you away at range. You don't seem to quite comprehend it, do you? Yachiro told her calmly. I told you all of that because it simply didn't matter if I did. Because it wouldn't change anything. Aiming her lightning blade upwards, Yachiro gave Sela a brief mocking smile before swiping down, the action mirrored perfectly by the other entities around her. All the energy around the limbs was released in one sweeping attack, the 3 strikes blending into one at Sela's angle. Sela was more than ready for it though. With the release of her attack, she would tear away not only the ground around her but also everything directly in front of her. That was until one of the lightning slashes slammed into her body, causing her to cry out in pain before the other 2 hit her. That was impossible. She had already seen the timings of the entities with Yachiro, and an attack like that should have reached her a moment later, going by how fast the strike from the pink fur creature was moving it. That creature's strikes always happened first. I told you, Yachiro called out, skipping over with her 2 helpers. It won't matter. Is that really dashed? She was forcefully cut off as a hand gripped her head and slammed her into the ground, causing her to release an involuntary cry of pain as she was forced into the ground. Pathetic Sela, Mardgear stated, keeping Yachiro pinned to the ground. He paid no attention to the creatures around him, more than aware that they would be able to do nothing if Yachiro didn't mirror the action. You should have been able to tell she was baiting you. She purposefully showed you the timings so you would make the very assumption you made. So you would base everything on the actions of what you believed would be the first to happen. But Mardgear is not a fool, Mardgear added as he turned down towards Yachiro. Mardgear knows your trick. You let one of the others go first and then you make the next set of strikes led by someone else. It's hard enough to fight against 3 separate attack timings. It's another level of difficulty entirely when you can't even work out which is going to be the first to react. Worked on you once, Yachiro chuckled before groaning as her head was lifted back up briefly and slammed back down into the ground. That hurts. It should. Mardgear overestimated you. You may have gotten the drop on Sela but you barely managed to injure her. Your power is vastly weaker than it once was. And it continues to drop. Merely using your demonic power as you are seems to be speeding up its loss. So why did you even bother to fight? For the sake of your dead student. Yachiro's only response was a smile, her eyes seeming to twinkle with glee. It's obvious, isn't it? I don't need to avenge him. He'll avenge himself. I just had to finish giving him everything I had left to give. What? Mardgear couldn't help but tilt his head, confused at Yachiro's words. Mardgear does not understand. What do you mean? Isn't it obvious? I'm saying that you really shouldn't be hurting me so much or Kenny will get mad. The brief spike of magical power was not enough to warn him about the fist that slammed straight into his face, knocking him away. He hadn't stopped tumbling before Yachiro had been pulled away, the attacker having retreated back to where he had come from. Yachiro! What have you done? Yachiro smiled at the familiar voice, looking up at the man holding her in his arms. It's all yours now, Kenny. For as long as you can keep your body moving. Yachiro made to reach up towards him with her hand only for it to fall limb halfway up, brief surprise showing on her face. Seems I'm dying myself now. That's what I get for giving you all my remaining magic, I suppose. I don't have enough to keep myself alive in this body anymore. You can still save yourself. That was desperation in Kenny's voice. She didn't hear it too often and it was normally only in a fight. Remake your body. The pieces are all here. Yachiro shook her head. I don't want to. If you're going to vanish, I will too. I'm not going back to a world of solitude again. The skeleton and fur creature nearby both fell to the ground, the magic running through them emptying. Yachiro meanwhile began to fade entirely, her weight vanishing in Kenpaika's arms. Just enjoy this, Kenny. It'll be the last fight you'll ever have. She smiled at him, even as she vanished before his eyes, leaving only her last words for him to hear. Don't worry about avenging me. Just have all the fun in the world. And die the way you have always wanted to. Kenpaika slowly lowered his arms as the body he held finished fading, empty clothes falling to the ground by his feet. Taking a deep breath, he turned towards Mardgear as the demon got back to his feet. How is this possible? Sela asked. He should be dead. Yachiro was buying time for this, Mardgear stated. She wanted to buy him enough time so that she could transfer all of her remaining power into him. She's replenished all the energy he lost and then some. But his heart. It's still pierced. Magic shouldn't make a difference. Indeed. Except I know what he's doing. He's doing similar to what Yachiro did but on his own body. If his heart won't beat, he'll force it to beat using his lightning. If his body begins to become sluggish, he'll speed up the signals with his magic. It won't save him, using up this amount of magic will burn him out completely in 10 minutes at most, but he doesn't intend for that. He intends to make this a last stand. There are 3 of us. We cannot lose. No, Mardgear muttered. Something's still off. What did Yachiro do? What do you mean? You've noticed it, haven't you? Kenpaika called out. She always gave me everything she wanted if she could. This power, this is both hers and mine. She's pushed me past even my own limits, straight into the territory of another. This is honestly nothing special. Others have done it before. have stepped into the territory of other beings like dragons and gods. I'm merely joining them briefly. Impossible, Mardgeir muttered, sensing the massive increase in magical power. This is what she did. But this shouldn't exist. Kenpeka laughed. Because you never saw a Devil Slayer using this mode? You simply didn't encounter enough of us to ever find one who could use this. Lightning began to cloak Kenpeka before it solidified around his body, shaping into a form of skeleton-like armor similar to the bones that had made up one of Yachiro's two creatures. Purple lightning continued to cycle around the armor while the cracks in between pieces gained the same glow as the energy surrounding it. At the same time Kenpeka's skin began to change, turning red while black markings began to stretch across his face. A pair of small horns stretched out from Kenpeka's forehead as the transformation finished, leaving Kenpeka to glance over his body. So this is it, Kenpeka muttered as he turned back to Mardgeir. Those fancy names of drives and such never really bothered me that much. I named my strikes because Yachiro wanted me to. She seemed to like it. But this time I don't suppose I mind saying its name freely. Dragon Slayers had their Dragon Force. God Slayers had their God Oversoul. And us Devil Slayers? We have our Devil Stigma. You should prepare yourself, Kenpeka added as he took a step forward ready to fight. I'm not going to let you wait for me to die. I'm going to enjoy this to fullest for as long as I have left, and in that time I intend to tear you all limb from limb. Protector of the Fairies. No Zerashi, the weather-beaten one. Mardgeir, Sela spoke quietly. What do we do? If he wait him out he'll chase us down. He was fast before. Now, I have no idea. Doesn't matter how little experience he has with this mode, the degree of power he'll have available will be far greater in all aspects. This is the time to use your toy. Have him fight alongside you and buy me time. Time? For what? For me to prepare my trump card to stop him. Just hold him back. Spinning around Mardgeir took to the skies, rushing off to the giant tree still growing in the distance. Kenpeka glanced at him go before bending his knees. Where on earth do you think you're going? Sela rushed at him to intercept him but she was far too slow. One moment he was there, the next he had slammed straight into Mardgeir and ripped a wing from his back as he passed. Mardgeir. She barely made it in time to grab her leader as he fell, thankful that he hadn't gotten too far when Kenpeka did what he did. Are you dashed? She was cut off when a fist coated in lightning slammed into her, forcefully separating her and Mardgeir as she lost her grip from the blow. Skidding to a stop, she took one look at Kenpeka before he was suddenly right before her, his right hand tightly gripping her by the neck. Is this all you've got now? He asked, sounding almost disappointed to her ears. She didn't waste time on it though, using the brief bit of air she could get to call out words. I order you to kill Kenpeka's Araki. Kenpeka frowned at the words before suddenly releasing Sela, just in time to dodge a barrage from Byakuya's Zanpakuta from above. Glancing up he spotted the Shinigami standing there in the air, surrounding by the petals of his Zanpakuta. I've sealed off access to my Bankai, he heard Byakuya call out briefly as he shifted his focus between all three of his enemies. My Zanpakuta is ensuring it isn't released without my consent but I can't do the same for my Shikai. Be careful. It doesn't matter anyway, Kenpeka replied. You aren't going to make much of a difference here. Spotting Mardgeir trying to retreat back he brought his hand up and allowed a large lance of lightning to form in his grasp. Get back here. He roared as he threw the projectile at Mardgeir, the demon quickly generating a massive barrier of thorns between himself and Kenpeka. It only stopped the attack from hitting him, not from being thrown back by the resulting force as his thorn barrier shattered. Appearing above Mardgeir, Kenpeka made to swing his arm down before attacks assaulted him from all sides, forcing him to leap upwards to escape. That however put him right into the waiting arms of Sela, positioned ready with the attack she had intended to use to kill Yachiro with. Be blown away. She roared as the attack fired, slamming directly into Kenpeka at point-blank range. Keeping up with the attack for as long as she could, she found it forcefully broken apart when a hand broke through the blast and gripped her own, forcefully covering her eye and ending the spell. I'll say it again. Is that all you've got now? Gripping her by the hand tightly his other hand shot out and gripped the same arm just above her wrist. Before she could make any sign of resistance he pulled, ripping her right hand clean from her body before throwing her down towards the ground in pain. The second she was away from him, petals slammed into him from all sides. A second later and they were all swatted away through sheer force of magical power, lightning intensifying all around Kenpei's body. "This will probably hurt Byakuya," Kenpei said towards the controlled Shinigami as he landed on the ground. "Nothing I can do about it." Lightning continued to flicker around his right palm before he leapt up from the ground, heading straight for Byakuya. A barrier of blade fragments was already waiting for him but he didn't care. Lightning continued to expel from his body as he swatted the barrier away, chasing down Byakuya as he tried to escape with Shunpo. "Just where do you think you're going?" Kenpei asked as he arrived at Byakuya's destination before the Shinigami could get any further, pressing his palm against the man's back. All the lightning from his palm fired directly into the Shinigami just before Byakuya could swing his sword. As a result nothing happened, lightning flickering around Byakuya's body and making it impossible for him to move anyway. Gripping the man tightly by the back of his clothes, Kenpei spun round and chucked Byakuya far away, watching for a moment as he sailed across the sky back towards the barrier. "Did I throw him far enough?" Kenpei muttered. "No matter. He'd probably die if he stayed here like that anyway. Now for the other two." Turning his attention back to the two demons, he watched them preparing for another round. It even appeared like they had something planned too. It would be so easy to crush them both right now. His power was showing that. But even so. "Bring out whatever tricks you have left," he called out. "This is my last fight. I don't want one as pathetic as this. Make me at least have a challenge before death or just cut your own throats to save me the trouble." "You'll wait?" Mardgear asked, a mocking smile growing on his face. "You'll regret that you realize. But thank you. I'll be happy to help assist in your method of suicide." "Sela." "Yes sir. Increase your limits completely. Set them beyond what you can achieve." Sela paused, turning towards Mardgear in shock. "Mardgear. Do it. Or do you wish to upset me?" "No Mardgear. I would never dream to. But I'll die." "Your death will serve a far greater cause," Mardgear assured her. "After today Hell's core will be restored. I can bring back all our fallen allies and show Master Zeref we are worthy of his attention once more. But for that to happen you first must die. Do you not seek to make Master Zeref happy?" "I do," Sela stated. Merely hearing that this would draw Master Zeref back to them was enough for her to throw away all her reservations. "I order myself to unlock my third origin." Kenpei frowned, ignoring Mardgear for the moment as he focused all his attention on her. "Third origin? What the fuck is that?" He wasn't oblivious to the way her magical power was rapidly increasing, nor how her wings had now gained multiple eyes that matched the one on her hand that he had ripped off. What did interest him though was the way her magical power reached and then surpassed his own, even in this state. "You were still holding all this back." His only response was a loud piercing scream before every eye on the wing opened up, a massive array of runes circling all around Sela. Oh crap! The blast that followed was not like the one he had blocked and parted with one hand. This one made it like the whole world before him had turned white, the blast radius so vast it must have reached up to the sky from his perspective. He wasn't sure how far the blast continued past him but he was sure that if he had been at the opposite side to her that it would have reached the barrier itself, eradicating every human and demon in its path. For him though, it was still the exact kind of magic he was meant to resist. His devil stigma only enhanced that. Even with all that, it was still a challenge to not get blown away in the blast. His feet were digging into the ground but that barely helped when the ground itself was being reduced to nothing more than dust. Lightning exploded out all around him as he weathered through the storm of magical power, his bone armor chipping in multiple areas before it finally came to an end. The second it did he was greeted by a hand to his face, grabbing it and shoving him right down onto his back and into the dirt. Whatever follow-up attack that the demon had planned never would have reached, not when he vanished from her grasp only to reappear right above her with his leg swinging down at her back. Releasing a torrent of lightning down from it he forced her to sink into the ground from the force, the ground shattering all around them as a result. He underestimated the newfound strength she had though. In the moment between when she was free from the ground as it crumbled and when she would have been sent crashing back into it, she rolled over in the air. With her sole hand she grabbed him above his left foot and twisted, shattering the bone armor in the area and the bones in his ankle. The pain did nothing to deter Kenpeki. Instead he laughed, bringing up the leg she was gripping to and lashing out to one side. She let go as he expected her to, and he sent a volley of lightning blasts after her, half of them impacting against her skin and causing some damage while the rest went wild and simply cleared the nearby area of thorns in their explosions of lightning. "This is more like it," he roared, a wide smile breaking out on his face. "Why did you hold all of this back? You could have crushed me with this without all those sneaky tactics. This is the kind of opponent I was looking for to die against." Placing his leg back down, he put a bit of pressure on the ankle before watching as the bone armor regenerated and formed a support over the broken limb. "Good. This thing isn't going to let me down so easily. I bet it would try and make me still able to fight even if I broke every bone in my body." His head shot back towards Sela before he rushed towards her. "Let's find out, shall we?" Bringing back his fist as he charged, he met Sela halfway as both their fists slammed against one another. The armor covering his fist cracked but not enough to shatter it, Kenpeki's smile widening at the sign of damage and that he wasn't able to push Sela back. Equally she was unable to push him back, a snarl being heard from her as she tried to push any advantage she could get. With neither gaining any ground she quickly swung up with one leg, Kenpeki catching it by her knee with the palm of his other hand. Lightning briefly sparked from his fingers before she released her grip against Kenpeki's fist and swiped her hand over to his wrist. Using his momentum as he was pulled forward she spun in the air, allowing the wing attached to her held leg to slash into Kenpeki's side. The wing sliced through the armor like butter, cutting deep into Kenpeki's side and forcing more of the precious blood he had left to spill out. The armor quickly sealed up the moment her wing left his side, however, Kenpeki briefly vanishing from her sight as his body changed before her eyes. The next moment she felt a burst of pain tear across her back, Kenpeki's arm held up with blood falling from his fingers. Pressing them together he formed a much thinner lightning blade than his previous variants, not wasting a drop as he lunged forward at her as she spun. One of her legs came up as she hastily struggled to bring a wing up in front of her body and she was just in time to defend herself. None of that stopped Kenpeki's hand from piercing straight through it, falling short just before her chest. However, at the same time that had his arm trapped there for a brief moment, one she was quick to exploit as she slashed forward with her sole hand. Kenpeki tried to pull his head back in time but was slightly too slow, the eye on her palm opening up right before his face and firing a blast straight at him. Pulling his arm free a moment later, Kenpeki retreated back, the smoke clearing around his face to reveal the mess made of it. "That attack's gotten stronger," he commented, noticing the loss of vision in his right eye. All he had been able to do in that brief moment was tilt his head slightly, and that had been the saving grace that limited the damage done. The whole right side of his face, however, had not been left off lightly, heavy burns covering every inch of it with his right eye missing from its socket. Even bone was visible in the bottom half of the damaged area. "What did you do? Condense all that power down into one eye? Not bad." Sela didn't bother replying to him, desperately trying to recover her breath. Had it even been a minute? She didn't think so, and yet she was already this tired. Her magical power was also beginning to drop drastically, and that attack just then had not helped. Just how long would Third Origin last before she ran out of steam? She had to end this while she could still do damage. That attack hadn't done nearly as much as she had wanted it to, but she knew she still had a chance. Either Mardgear would finish his preparations or she would be killed in another minute's time when her power dropped below this monster's and caused him to move on to her leader. She had to act while she still could. "I order myself," she muttered. "Fight to your last breath." Self-preservation would only get in the way now. Even if Kenpeki was on a time limit, hers would be extinguished first if she tried to outlast him. She was going to die either way, so she had to make use of this time. As such, she charged in as fast as she could, unafraid of the lightning being thrown towards her as she charged. It didn't matter how deadly it was nor how much damage it could do. Instead, she just put up her handless arm in front of her as a shield and took the full brunt of the attacks against the limb. The lightning left nothing more than a bloody mess, the lightning tearing the whole limb apart. The second sparks began to flicker around it. She tore the whole arm off and discarded it, unwilling to risk the paralysis to her body that Mardgeir had suffered under. Kenpeka was waiting for her as she reached him, his smile looking far more demented with his ruined face. Rather than a single hand being coated in lightning, this time the whole right limb was covered in his magic. Devil Slayer's secret art, Fang Slicing Blade. With no time to reach him in this moment, Seela had no choice but to dig her feet into the ground and widen her wings as much as possible. The hole through one of them had destroyed some of her eyes, but there was still more than enough for what she needed it for, a brief layer of runes surrounding her before the attack was expelled at full force. With so little time to prepare compared to the last time, the attack was vastly reduced in scale. It still completely filled Kenpeka's vision for a moment, but that all ended when he swung his arm all the way down, a massive wave of lightning tearing straight through the blast and continuing much further beyond it. Seela was caught completely helpless when it reached her, slicing straight through her body at her right side and severing both her leg and wing. Whatever pain she felt, however, was not enough to make her stop, with the command still forcing her to act, causing her to use all the strength she could muster to leap up from the ground with her remaining foot. Without the other wing, any attacks she tried with them would be unbalanced, potentially even dangerous to herself. But her command didn't let her ignore that option if it could grant her a chance of success. All around her, runes generated, forming multiple layers of circles as she poured whatever magic she had left into the attack. At the same time, she brought up her remaining hand, holding it across her body as even more layers of runes appeared around the single eye. With the right wing gone, she would have to utilize her left hand in this way to keep the attack stable long enough to fire. Kenpeka meanwhile was already preparing himself, lighting flickering around his body as he prepared to meet her in the sky. Suddenly he was shooting up, the ground shattering under the force of his leap. He was attempting to charge her at full force, the lightning around his body greatly increasing as he prepared to rip her into pieces. She wouldn't allow that to happen, firing the attack instantly with everything she had left and enveloping Kenpeka in the blast. Despite that, however, she could only feel fear. With each passing moment, Kenpeka's magical power got closer and closer. He wasn't being knocked away, even after all the force being pushed down on him from her blast as she tried to send him back to the ground. And after a time not nearly long enough for her, he was suddenly breaking out of the spell, millimeters away from her, with that same insane grin across his face as the last thing she saw. Kenpeka wasted no time as he appeared, tearing through her and leaving her body to fall behind him as he continued to soar upwards. He had underestimated the strength of his jump, it seemed, not that it mattered much. Instead, he turned his attention towards the only other source of high magical power in the nearby area, the one below him fading away to nothing with the demon's death. And then he was moving, heading right towards his target as flashes of lightning across the sky. "So this is where you ran off to," Kenpeka commented when he hit the ground, the smoke from his landing temporarily constricting his vision. Thorns from all sides attempted to take advantage of that opening, but the waves of lightning coming off him were more than enough to shatter any that dared approach. "I waited long enough. That demon over there gave me some fun, so what about you? What have you got for me?" "Why, this, of course," Mardgeir replied as the smoke cleared, his hand held upwards as the giant tree behind him reached its full height up at cloud level. "Dia Yggdrasil? That tree? Am I supposed to be Desh?" Kenpeka's words were cut off as he stumbled, catching himself with one hand as he fell towards the ground. "What the? Do you feel it?" Mardgeir asked mockingly. "Mardgeir certainly does. Feel your strength fade away and grant it towards another. So this is your trump card, huh?" Kenpeka muttered. His magical power was dropping like crazy, and he doubted he was the only one feeling the effects of such a spell. He could feel demons dropping like flies in the distance, and the same was happening with his own allies to a lesser extent, the closest even fading entirely as the tree before him sucked away all the magic in their bodies, even the tiniest amounts of magic that they required to live. And with every drop taken, the demon before him grew stronger, that well of magical power being gathered and granted to Mardgeir. "I'm disappointed I waited so long for this. That is because you are about to die. But even so, I won't take the chance that you can still fight. Even with the limited power you have left, it will take Dia Yggdrasil far too long to finish you off for my liking. So I'll end this in one blow." Thrusting his hands forward, Mardgeir slammed them together at the wrists as a dark mist rapidly began to form from his palms. Perish. Nice try, but it won't be enough. Kenpeki roared as he charged, darting forward as lightning and appearing right before Mardgear. He was still too slow, the mist slamming into him and halting his fist as it slammed against it. The mist didn't stop at just that, surrounding him entirely and widening as it began to stretch towards the sky. It was only then, as the scale of the spell increased, did Kenpeki truly notice what was surrounding him. Spirits. Hundreds or thousands, the number was too large for him to have a chance at counting. Even as he tried to move, they reached for him, gripping onto wherever they could find surface and tearing into and away at his armor before moving on to ripping away the flesh from his bones. It was an odd feeling, however. The attack didn't make him feel like he was dying, but neither did it feel like he was still alive within its grasp. It was like he was simply being erased, piece by piece. Memento mori, Mardgear stated from outside the spell, watching as it finally began to end after having reached the sky. It had taken gathering all the energy from Dia Yggdrasil to cast the spell on such a level, but he was sure the results had been worth it. This had been a spell he had created himself in order to kill Zeref, one that would ignore the concepts of life and death and simply erase the ones caught in it from existence. No traces would be left, not even their magic. Which was why he found it so shocking when a flash of lightning tore out of the attack, slicing into the ground beside him. "No," Mardgear muttered. "That's impossible." His words didn't help him, more lightning beginning to fire out from the spell as each second passed. He forced even more power into his spell, desperately trying to speed it up and to erase Kenpeki before it was too late. But he realized immediately that he had already lost that chance when the spell shattered before his eyes, lightning flying in all directions from Kenpeki's position. His spell had been working. He could see a lot of the flesh from Kenpeki's body had been stripped away, the bones of the man's body exposed in so many areas and only held together by the larger areas of flesh and muscle. In some areas thought it was even worse. His whole left arm was only held there by the lightning, bolts of it constantly circling the bones and keeping them attracted to one another so they wouldn't fall away. The only explanation for how he could have even survived had to have been his Devil Slayer magic giving him a greater resistance to the magic than any of the subjects he had tested it on. However, even in such a state Kenpeki still moved, his lightning cloaking every inch of his form as his smile grew wider than he had ever seen it do in the fight. Devil Slayer's final art. No. He swung both arms down, massive thorns from all directions raising and preparing to slam down on the both of them. It didn't matter how much damage he took nor what state he ended up in afterwards. This was Kenpeki's final strike, and he knew deep down he would not survive it if he took it head on. Readying his strike, Kenpeki reached to his left side with his right hand and grabbed his bones, pulling them free as he poured every last drop of power he had left around the bone. The result formed a giant blade of lightning, stretching up the sky as he prepared to strike down. Lightning Oni, no Zerashi. The bone lightning blade swung down, everything in its path being felled. Mardgear found himself freezing as the blade cut not only through him but also through the massive tree behind him, time seeming to freeze to him. Then he fell, the top half of his body sliding down at the same time as the tree behind him did the same. "Master! Zeref! Please, come back to us." Like he would, Kenpeki spoke down to the demon before he felt his grip on his bone vanish. He looked down to see what had happened just in time to see the bone crumbling into dust. Ah! So this is it for real this time. The remains of the magic Yachiru had given him were almost gone now, and his body was beginning to feel the effects of his previous actions. He had taken more than enough punishment fighting Sela, and the effects of Mardgear's final spell were taking its toll now too. There would be no more fighting now. He could almost imagine what Yachiru would be saying right now. "Did you enjoy it?" He chuckled, or at least he thought he did. He wasn't even sure if it was his mind producing the sound or his throat anymore. "I did. It was the best. I'm glad. I always tried to keep my promises." He had gotten what he wanted. A fight like no other, where he had been pushed far beyond his limits and got to experience just how strong his enemies could be. And, in the end, he was dying as he wanted, in battle, proud of the fight he had taken part in. He had no regrets now. Not even that you never got that one wish. Not even that, he replied to the voice he was imagining. "I don't need to fight you anymore, Yachiru. By letting me fight again, one last time, you let me get everything that I wanted. A fight against enemies so powerful that I might even die against them. And a fight where I was not treated with care or gone easy on, but a fight where every part of me was considered a threat. The last fragments of his consciousness faded as the rest of his bones turned to dust, being blown away in the wind as his clothes fell to the ground. All that remained of the man was the victory he had brought and the final decimation of the demon's army and any attempts it had of revival, the last of the demons present finally falling as Ishgar let loose cheers of celebration. Yachiru. Thank you. Protector of the Fairies. Fascinating. It seems that Kenpeka's Araki and the remainder of the demon army has been eliminated. What occurred, I wonder? Waiwak turned towards Ichigo for an answer only to watch the Shinigami lash out at him with the larger of his two blades. His own blade shot up in defense, not enough to halt the blade entirely but enough that it meant he was only forced back a few steps from the assault. In the same swift motion that he stepped back, he sliced down with his sword as it came free, the blade deflecting and destroying the few arrows that came close to making contact with him. Not in a mood to speak? I guess I can relate. With a flick of his wrist, arrows of pure light formed all around him, held in the air for only a moment before being launched directly at Ichigo. They were all shot down before they even reached Ichigo. However, Uriu's aim never wavering from his targets once. With the removal of an incoming threat, Ichigo was free to charge straight at Waiwak. Pouring energy into the smaller of his two blades, he wasted no time in swinging it towards Waiwak, a blast of energy being released across the arc. It only took a swat of Waiwaka's hand to disperse it entirely, but in that time Ichigo had closed the gap, the larger blade of Zanjutsu swinging down once again. Before it could make contact though, Ichigo was flung away, Waiwaka's fist held where Ichigo's stomach had been a moment before. There was little time for anyone to rest as arrows were already flying through the air even before Ichigo had been knocked away, Uriu never letting up on his pinpoint assaults. Dodging the first few arrows, Waiwak quickly darted towards Uriu, forcing the Quincy to retreat back with Hiran Kyaku as Waiwak gave chase. Their previous encounters had already shown that he was vastly inferior to Waiwaka's speed in this state, but that didn't matter. By the time that Waiwak had closed the gap, he had gotten close enough to Ichigo for him to take over. Appearing before Uriu just as Waiwak swung his sword down, Ichigo caught it against the edge of his larger Zanpakuto. The smaller blade immediately was thrusted forward, but Waiwak had already retreated back, lightly kicking back from where he had stood to come to rest near the stairs of his throne. Is that all you two are going to bring to this fight? I'm disappointed that I even thought so highly of the two of you. Ichigo and Uriu tried to ignore his taunts, but it wasn't easy. When they looked at Waiwak, they saw a man who had yet to take a single bit of damage. Even his clothes were just as pristine as before. They meanwhile had taken cuts and bruises since the fight had begun, most of the damage visible on Uriu as he tried to keep up with the other two. Ichigo's had all vanished by this stage, never lasting so long that his regeneration stayed at full power. Even so, the same weight Uriu felt was experienced by him despite there being few visible differences between his and Waiwaka's conditions. They weren't making any progress. Even with the two of them, they still couldn't reach Waiwaka's level as they were. Not without releasing much more of their power, a fact both were becoming well aware of. What are you two waiting for? Waiwak asked, his sword held ready despite the calmness in his words. Use your Bankai. Use Volstandig. Otherwise you might as well not even be trying. Don't listen to him, Ichigo, Uriu called back, narrowing his eyes at Waiwak as the man smirked at the two of them. That's what he wants, for you to unleash your Bankai and all the energy it generates. He's planning something. You got a better idea? Ichigo shot back. Nothing is going to change if we keep this stalemate going. Your Bankai being released will blow away our surroundings in such an enclosed area. You release too much energy, and this narrow space is far more to Waiwaka's advantage than our own. Why give that up unless he doesn't plan to? Listen to him for now, Ichigo, Mavis whispered from his shoulder, glancing around every so often to look for traps that the other two couldn't spot. Wait until we get some more space. Ichigo let out a sigh before responding to Uriu. Fine, we'll play this your way for the time being. But that means you're taking the lead now. I'll be happy to, Uriu stated, pulling back his left sleeve to reveal a silver bangle around his wrist, the typical Quincy symbol etched into the surface of the metal. With a small clicking sound the latch released and it fell down to the ground, the air around Uriah becoming alive to the eyes of the Tuhukan. The five-pointed star of all Quincy burst to life over his head while a pair of wings formed from his back, shaped like those of a bird's. The only odd part about them however was how different each feather was, no symmetry at all between the two. One feather at the end of the left wing was coated in purple lightning, the exact same magical signature being given off it that Kenpei's Araki had. The feather at the end of the right wing however was nothing more than a bone, hanging there suspended by the wing's frame. Volstandig, Uriah stated calmly. Mind of God. Despite the threat before him, Wywak could only look on at Uriah's Volstandig with interest. Fascinating. This is the first time I have ever seen you use your Volstandig. I suspect this is the first battle you have even used it in too. Its form is truly interesting however. The number of types of magic that you have access to is counted on the feathers of the wings, from the basic knowledge you obtained and trained in to add diversity to your power to the latter additions of Kenpei's Araki's Lightning Devil Slayer magic and Giselle's the Zombie. I see now that Ichigo's influence has had a positive effect on your power. Wouldn't you agree? Are you sure you should be standing there so calmly? Uriah asked, raising his right hand back up. The bow in his hands shattered before the same energy it was made of reformed into a new shape, increasing in size and gaining new markings along its surface. His other hand quickly rose to the bowstring and pulled it back, an arrow forming in the air that he fingers dragged along. It wasn't made of pure energy alone however but of multiple conflicting elements, all fusing together at the tip of the arrow into one single spell. Catch it! For once since the fight had started, Wywak didn't simply dodge the arrow or try to cut it down. Instead he slammed his sword straight down into the ground, the energy of the blade digging in and fusing with the energy that made up the ground. Barriers sprung up around him but they were only halfway complete when the arrow reached him, smashing into the wall before it and tearing right through in the resulting explosion. A moment later Wywak shot right out of the debris he had been flung back into and sliced down at Uriah, a new blade in his hands. Uriah rapidly took a step back as he made to dodge, not having to move far when Ichigo cut in right in front of him to block Wywak's strike. His second arrow was already knocked on his bow, this one larger than the previous arrow and with the arrowhead burning like a fire. Wywak had already pulled back as the arrow was released, the projectile soaring over the Quincy King's head and releasing a torrent of flames in all directions as it slammed into the nearby wall. Abyss break, Wywak stated calmly, ignoring the streams of flame licking at the ground behind him. That was your first arrow, formed from all the required elements to construct it. You did well to fuse them together to make the spell but the size of that arrow should be an indication of how much power you are able to pack into Abyss break without the arrow becoming unstable. That attack is meaningless if I can still withstand it. Uriah narrowed his eyes in annoyance, his grip tightening on his body as he confirmed Wywak's condition with his own eyes. Abyss break had only scored a partial hit on Wywak thanks to the man's hastily made barrier but he could see now that even that would not yet be enough. Wywak's blood vein was strong enough to take a direct hit with the arrow and still keep fighting. Maybe if he made it a bit stronger it might be able to blow away an arm if he aimed right but for that he would need more time to properly focus on stabilizing the arrow, time he would not get if Wywak noticed what he was doing. Giving a quick glance towards Ichigo, he saw his ally nod. Good. Ichigo knew what they needed to do here. If he could clear out the area and open them up to the rest of the compound rather than this one large room, Ichigo would be able to activate his Bankai without worry and then use his high levels of speed to their fullest in the wide open spaces of the sky. Only then would Wywak's focus drift away from him again and allow him time to charge a sufficiently strong enough arrow to try and end it in one shot. Preparing a new arrow, he found Wywak was already rushing towards him before he had even begun to draw the string back. Ichigo was fast to engage Wywak before he could reach him, catching Wywak's blade against his own as he tried to hold his ground. The blood Wywak was using sudden changed and Ichigo was immediately overpowered, sent flying backwards away as Wywak continued his original path. The delay had been enough however, Uriah's new arrow ready for firing. First thing they had to do was expose the fastest opening to the outside. That was the wall where Wywak had dissolved to show them the outside world and the army awaiting them. So as he aimed the arrow, he could only hope Wywak would dodge rather than try and take the arrow head on. Releasing it, he prayed as it flew, the explosive forces he had stored within the arrowhead begging to be released. Wywak dodged, but something in his expression or actions must have given him away as Wywak reached out at the last second and grabbed the arrow by the shaft, shattering it down into energy and releasing the explosive force harmlessly behind him. The smirk on Wywak's face told him everything that he needed to know. His plan was completely visible to that man's eyes, Wywak even going as far as to take steps back to put himself in a defensive position. So that was how he wanted to play it. Fine then. He could oblige. A new arrow formed at his fingertips, this time containing the most powerful types of wind magic he had ever managed to grasp the basics of. It was shot down halfway to Wywak, multiple arrows being pre-made and surrounding Wywak ready for firing. Another arrow was quickly loaded, filled with a mass amount of lightning in the hopes of utilizing the piercing nature to break through the arrow. It worked on one arrow, but two more impacted his arrow in the next moment, stopping the arrow before it could reach Wywak. These arrows weren't powerful enough. He simply couldn't pack enough power into such basic attacks like this to overpower Wywak in a straight-up fight. If it was Ichigo then. Wait. Where was Ichigo? Wywak didn't appear to be worried, so that meant he had to be somewhere behind him, but why had he not made any other moves? Unless... Oh. He understood why. Two arrows formed on his bow, one filled with fire and the other water. With Abyss Break he could have broken through, but Wywak would never allow that. And with these arrows, any hope to break through was being shot down as Wywak played with him. So instead he should stop trying to beat him in a game he could not win at and instead ensure that they broke free at any cost. The arrows fired and Wywak did exactly as he wanted him to. He shot the arrows down mid-flight. The second the arrows were hit, their contents detonated, fire and water flying everywhere and mixing together to form a giant smoke screen between the two of them. In the brief time he had, a new arrow was being loaded and packed with all the power he could condense down in the time he had. With only seconds to spare he aimed and fired, putting it on a direct at where he could still sense Wywak. Even Wywak was capable of missing in such conditions, and so his arrow passed through smoke screen completely unopposed, the only time Wywak had to stop it being before it could pass him. It was still shot down by Uri, who had planned for just that. By the time Wywak had managed to fire, the arrow was only a meter away, the contents of the arrow detonating upon impact. Wywak's blood venet would have helped the man ignore every bit of damage, but then that was what he had expected. All that was in that arrow was concussive force, enough to send Wywak flying back across the room. Skidding to a halt, Wywak came to a stop mere inches away from the back wall, new arrows forming ready to fire in retaliation. Getchuga. As the smoke screen cleared, Wywak came face to face with a wall of pure black energy just in front of where Uriu had been standing, wrapped around the hilt of a large blade. Every arrow he had made fired, but it was too late to stop the swing of the blade, all the energy stored on it being released in one fell swoop. Tenshou. His arrows did nothing more than feed the blast. As the attack rushed towards him, he quickly stretched out with his palm, digging his feet into the ground as the blast hit him. He refused to allow it to reach him, the energy being forced apart as he tore the attack into pieces bit by bit. All that remained as the attack cleared was some slight burns to Wywak's left hand from catching the attack on, the rest of his body perfectly unharmed. The same, however, could not be said for the wall he had been standing in front of, falling apart all around him. It would have taken mere seconds to repair, but that was no longer time that Wywak had, Ichigo and Uriu breaking free at either ends of the wall right as the Getchuga Tenshou faded. Both immediately took the skies, heading upwards as they moved to reach the wider open spaces. Sighing in annoyance, Wywak followed up after them, his speed easily keeping pace with them until they finally came to a stop halfway between the barrier's roof and the complex itself. "So I assume this means you plan to use your Bankai now, Ichigo?" he asked, dozens of arrows forming all around him in preparation for any sign of attack. "Very well. Go ahead. Even with it, it will make no difference. The outcome of today has already been decided." "I know it has," Ichigo replied, his magical power beginning to rise as Uriu prepared to continue their shared fight. "Bankai. Protector of the fairies. The one who switches light and darkness. Wendy? Where are you?" "She's here," Guildarts whispered quietly, Wendy nodding silently in response. Are you sure you want to do this? I have to, Wendy whispered back, being careful to not raise her voice too much. If I don't, the alternative is that Kelia will stay our enemy. I don't want her to die. All right. But be careful then, warned Gildarts, an anxious look crossing his face for a brief moment. If I could help you I would. But in my state. It's all right, Wendy replied back reassuringly. I understand. Don't worry about me. If it's just Kelia, I can handle this alone. Slowly getting to her feet, she heard the approaching sounds of footsteps stop. If Kelia had stopped where she thought she had, then it meant Kelia was looking right into their cell right now. Nabera had told her what she would need to do and that her best chance would be before the fight could begin, while her focus was completely undivided. Her next action would be completely decided by whatever Kelia did next. Wendy? Where are you? If her friend began to head towards them, she would have to take cover and wait for her to pass. Gildarts was fairly well hidden so long as no one looked closely, so, as long as nothing looked out of place where they were hiding, Kelia should completely overlook them. If by any chance Kelia did spot Gildarts, she was hidden well enough that Kelia would have to pass her first in order to reach him. In that moment she could strike. If Kelia ignored them both, however, her focus would be further down and would allow her to be caught unaware by a surprise attack from behind. However, if Kelia went the other way, it made things slightly more difficult. Closing the distance between them both as fast as possible was her goal. Any increase in the distance she had to cross was another second longer that Kelia would have to react during if or when she noticed her. Luckily the chances of Kelia going away from them were minimal at worst. There weren't many places to hide near the entrance, part of why they hadn't tried to lay in wait there, and Kelia was sure to know that too. Are we playing hide and seek? Did you leave? And of course Kelia had to take the worst possible option for them. She could hear the sound of footsteps leaving them, and she knew if Kelia left the prison then it would become even harder to get to her peacefully. They were both weaker in an enclosed space like this, and she doubted she would be able to subdue Kelia if they got drawn up into a battle in the sky if Kelia started to run. She had to move. Slipping from her hiding spot as quietly as she could, she peered round the corner of her hiding space as carefully as she could. Her heart almost frozen and she forgot how to breathe for a second when she noticed Kelia was almost looking directly towards her. She resisted the urge to make any sudden movements, knowing Kelia's gaze was simply wandering, and a moment later it was facing the complete opposite direction from her. Any noise would draw it right back though. She had to be creative here and try not to make any noise. Her magic heard her call, but she stopped it before it could rise. Instead she drew upon its help in another manner. She didn't need the power of Dragon Force right now. She only needed the same protection magic granted her in such a state. Leaning up onto her tiptoes she pushed off lightly from the ground and remained hanging there. With another push, this time against the air itself, she carefully floated up towards the ceiling. Slowly. Carefully. She repeated that in her head like a mantra, the words forcing her to keep herself moving slowly. At any second Kelia could spin round. She knew how dangerous that would be, but moving quickly would only draw attention. Kelia was just as susceptible to the alterations in the flow of magic around them, and what she was doing right now had to be creating a small fluctuation. Moving slowly was the best chance of minimizing the risk she was taking. She was halfway towards Kelia when she saw the girl freeze in her tracks. Reacting as fast as she could, she slammed her feet against the ceiling and shot down towards the ground, uncaring at the noise she made. At the last second she abandoned her grip on the magic, right by the nearest cell to hide in, and then flung herself into the cell opposite where she had landed. She barely managed to catch herself as she landed, scraping across the ground roughly and cutting her skin across it. She held back any sounds she could have made as she pushed herself up and against the back of the wall beside the cell door, the only safe hiding spot she had. Any adult could never have managed to hide so well in this spot, but her size came in handy for once. Now the question was what Kelia would do next. She never would have made it to Kelia in the time she had. Not with the way Kelia had frozen like that. Kelia had been ready for an attack at that moment, definitely having noticed the fluctuation she had been causing. Hiding had been the best option, but Kelia would still have noticed where she had gone from the noise in her sight. So she split them up. If Kelia decided to pay attention to the noise she had heard, she would look in the cell she was hiding in. If that happened, she would have only a split second to act before Kelia caught on. However, if Kelia decided to trust in her sight instead, the trails of magic ending by the opposite cell, she would check there first. And if that happened, there would be a moment where Kelia's back would be completely exposed to her. The footsteps were drawing closer. Bringing up a hand to her face, Wendy quickly held it over her mouth, hoping to stifle her breathing so that Kelia wouldn't hear it. The footsteps came to a stop, but she couldn't yet determine what Kelia had decided yet. She had to wait just a bit longer. To be just a bit more patient. Finally she heard it. The footsteps appeared again, the noise growing that tiny bit distance from her. A stroke of luck. Nabera was clutched tightly in her right hand, so if there was any time to act, then it was now. Carefully stepping out from around the corner, keeping Nabera behind her back just case, she saw Kelia taking another step towards the cell, almost at the cell door. It would take little more than a second to look both ways once she reached the cell, and at that point Kelia would immediately know where she was. But even so, she couldn't rush yet. Carefully moving slowly, she prepared to rush forward at the drop of a hat. Kelia reached the edge of the cell doorway and she sprang into action, no time to waste. Kelia's head has just began to peer into the cell, looking towards the right, when she lunged, her speed increasing rapidly as she pushed the air out of the way of her path. Kelia had noticed now, but it was too late. She felt the energies of Nirvana wash over her as she reached out with her left hand, the flickering energies of black and white appearing around her hand like glittering lights. The increase in power had Kelia on far greater alert than before, but there wasn't enough time now, Wendy's hand making contact against Kelia's back before the older girl could finish her turn. Nirvana. The energy around her hand shot forward and slammed into Kelia's body, coursing through the Sky God Slayer for a moment before finally being expelled from the girl's chest. Wendy let a nervous smile appear on her face for a moment, wary on whether it had worked or not. That hope was shattered when Kelia spun round and swatted her down the corridor in one furious blow of black wind. Wendy! She heard Nabera's cry in her mind, but she could barely focus on it, catching herself as she gripped onto the air to slow down her momentum and come to a stop. Kelia was staring down towards her now, and she didn't think she had ever seen the girl so furious. Not once. It didn't work, Wendy muttered. It failed. Not exactly, spoke Nabera in her head. Nirvana worked, but your focus was off. Rather than changing the target of her obsession, you've altered her perception of you. Love and hate are both two sides of the same coin. But I wasn't focusing on that. No. But I assume you figured the easier way to deal with her obsession would be to direct it back towards you and to make yourself the new target. Your thoughts drifted too far away from the obsession and made Kelia's link with you into the target for Nirvana. From a best friend in her eyes, you are now the equivalent of her most hated enemy. Wendy let out a frustrated groan at the situation. I thought I had managed to do it. I'll never get another chance like that. Just move forward. Don't dwell on what you've lost or the mistakes you've made. I know more than enough about doing that. Instead, look towards the future here. Nirvana can work, you were close. So let's try it again, one more time. You can do it this time, I believe in you. All you have to do now is clear an opening to act in. That might not be so easier, Wendy muttered, her eyes widening as the black wind surrounding Kelia's hands began to expand and surround the God-Slayer's body, cloaking it in the dress of wind of her God Oversoul. She's really serious about this. She is. Don't hold back. This isn't the Kelia that sees you as a friend at an obsessive level, but an enemy who wants nothing more than to see you dead. Fight like your life depends on it, because it very well does. Wendy nodded, the wind around her intensifying as her body began to take on the characteristics of dragons. Feathers sprung out from her wrists and ankles, while the larger sets sprung out from her back as her hair changed color, turning pink and being pulled loose around her. She could feel her grip on the very air around her changing as a result, the act of pulling at it becoming as easy as breathing. It gave her the first warning of Kelia's attack before Kelia had even moved her fist an inch. Retreating would not do any good here. She would need direct contact to initiate Nirvana again. Her feet kicked straight off from the ground as Kelia swung her arm, slashes of wind being unleashed into the air. Each tore through the air at an alarming speed, but this space was not just Kelia's alone. The air was both of their domains. As the first slash was about to touch her, Wendy spun on her heel, moving just far enough out of the way for the first slash to pass her by. The second, only inches away from her face, was dodged in a similar way, returning her back to where she started as she dodged and weaved through the air. Nothing could hold her in place because not even the air posed a threat to her movements, flowing with her rather than against her. With the last of the slices of wind dodged, Wendy struck out herself. Wind sharpened around each finger of her left hand before she hesitated. That hesitation lasted for only a second. Kelia was her enemy right now, and as much as she didn't want to hurt her friend, she would have no choice on the matter. Besides, there was also the matter of Kelia's regeneration. She would need to muster up the strength to use crippling strikes against her friend if she wanted to even stand a chance at getting to Kelia. It was not an easy decision to make, but there was no other way. Her mind made up, she swung out with her hand, releasing her own slashes into the air. While Kelia's had come rapidly one after the other, each much larger than her own, hers came all at once, leaving little room to even move out of the way. She forgot one thing. Kelia was just as gifted as she was. The distance may have been even closer than before, but that didn't mean anything to Kelia. She still performed the same feat she had done previously, dodging effortlessly in the furthest corner of the attack where the largest hole in the attacks was. An arm was immediately swung up as Kelia kicked off from her position as the wind sailed over her head, releasing a wall of black wind straight at Wendy. That same wind was immediately smashed apart by the roar of a dragon, Wendy being held stationary in the air as vicious winds tore out from her throat. Rather than continuing to charge in, Kelia merely leaned out towards the breath attack and opened her mouth wide, eating all the wind before Wendy could stop her. The wind was forcefully cut off by its user, but it was too late to stop Kelia getting what she wanted, turning her head towards Wendy with black trails of wind leaking out from her mouth. Sky God's bellow. While Wendy had at least tried to contain her blast in sight of their situation, Kelia had no such quarrels. Her attack came at full force, tearing apart the whole corridor and every cell block in its range. Even the ceiling and floors weren't safe, bricks and tiles torn from their resting places and thrown into disarray as the full force of Kelia's magic went haywire. Wendy had a second to consider what to do before knowing she had only one choice. Gildarts would be caught in the blast if she didn't stop it, and if he took a hit like this in his condition he would be seriously hurt, if not outright killed. Stretching out with her palm towards the roar, she felt her vision flicker for a moment. The lacrima clenched in her palm glowed brighter as she called upon its magic, her sight altering as she began to see even more than she had ever before. Magic roamed all around her, but now she saw much more. She wasn't sure how she knew this would work, but the memory of fighting Kelia during the magic games flashed through her mind, the ideas it presented unable to be let go. The attack rocketing towards her was about to tear right into her and past, all in one direction. And so, with her hand being covered in the aura of Nirvana, she pushed it upwards as the attack was about to slam into her. She hadn't even been sure if it would have worked. The sight was odd, one she could only assume was how Nabara saw the world at all times. And if she had been even a second too far or slow in her actions, it may have not worked entirely. But it did. The wind, that had been about to tear into her, was all directed upwards, as if pulled up by an invisible force. And she supposed it really had been. She had seen the force of the attack all heading in her direction, and so with Nirvana she had simply twisted it and pushed it upwards instead. She felt her magic began to drain considerably as the attack continued to sail upwards, tearing away everything in its path until the winds finally began to clear away. As they did, she was treated to the sight of light shining down on them, coming from the surface far above. She was glad she hadn't tried to block that attack any other way. With the advantage God-slayers had against dragon-slayers, she was sure it wouldn't have ended very well. Even so, she couldn't expect to utilize such a spell many times more. Just diverting the attack had used up more magic than even her secret arts did. She wasn't even sure if she could get the timing down again either. A breath attack was one thing, it was all sent in one direction, but there were plenty of other attacks where she would need to account for much more if she wanted to safely redirect them. Luckily the way Kelia was looking at her made her think that she wouldn't have to worry about such a strike again. If this had been the Kelia she had fought during the Grand Magic Games, she would have had a problem. That Kelia would have treated it as a game, unafraid to charge in when faced against such a threat. But this Kelia? Being treated as an enemy did have its advantages since Kelia seemed sure she would be capable of using it each and every time. That's right, she heard Nabara said helpfully. Bluff through the situation. Force her to play the way you want her to. She'll be much more likely to fight you close up now that you've shown you can dodge or deflect her attacks. She'll be that much more wary of what you might pull and will want to ensure you can't get the chance. Find the right moment and use me once more to finish this. She nodded, clenching her free hand into a fist as she prepared for Kelia to make the next move. At a moment's notice she would be able to kick off from the air and intercept her, and hopefully find a break in Kelia's guard during that time. Rather than making a move towards her however, Kelia instead crouched down towards the ground and picked up a small bit of rubble from the ruined floor. Wind sliced into the debris in rapid succession until the uneven object Kelia had picked up was now sharpened into a dangerous spike. Her arm was immediately pulled back into a throwing motion as Wendy realized just what Kelia planned to do, rushing forward quickly to meet her. She had reacted too late to stop Kelia, the girl throwing the spike forward with all her strength. Wendy had already seen the magic beginning to work on it even before it was thrown, the enchantments both of them usually cast on their bodies being applied onto the spike itself. Therefore she was ready for the high speed she knew was coming. That still was almost not enough when combined with the wind pushing the spike forward, slicing straight through the air and passing through her hair as she moved her head just in time. Not letting Kelia have time to try such an action again, she slammed her fist down at her friend, Kelia raising one arm to block her strike with. Black wind pushed her back and that was all the time needed for Kelia to recover and regain the advantage. In a second the distance between them had been closed once more and Kelia was slicing upwards with another piece of rubble she had grabbed from the ground, the wind surrounding it turning it into a makeshift dagger. If nothing was done Wendy knew it would end up straight through her chest. Enhancing her body further with her magic she leapt up, narrowly avoiding the stab of the dagger as she pulled her legs closer to her body. Spinning in the air she unleashed them once again, wind wrapping round them as she brought both down at Kelia's head. The girl didn't even bother to dodge, taking the hit before grabbing one of Wendy's legs with her free hand and holding it tightly. Looking up she met Wendy's eyes with her own, even as blood trickled down from the wound on her forehead from the wind and obstructed her vision. The dagger quickly struck up and this time Wendy couldn't dodge entirely. All she could do was pull her body back up with the wind and avoid the majority of the blow. A sharp burst of wind fired down at Kelia but the Godslayer held on just long enough to allow her dagger to rip across Wendy's leg, leaving a large gash from her heel to her knee. Only then did she let go as Wendy let out a cry of pain, putting more magic into her attack to force Kelia to let go. Kelia waited only a brief moment before returning to the offensive, allowing her magic to have enough time to heal up the damage done to her head and arm. Wendy however did not have that luxury, being the one person who she could not heal with her magic. The pain hurt but she dulled it as best as she could by focusing on her magic. She couldn't heal herself but she could at least reduce the sensation from it until she could bandage it up. Kicking back on her one good leg, she underestimated the amount of strength she could do so with and found Kelia closing the gap faster than she had anticipated. That could still work to her advantage. With Kelia so close she kicked back against the air, advancing instead of retreating. Nirvana began to glow brightly in her hand as she reached forward, the flicking of black and white light around her left palm intensifying as she reached for any part of Kelia that she could grab. She missed. Whether it was because she had misread Kelia's plans or Kelia had seen through hers, it didn't matter. At the last moment before she could make contact Kelia had leapt up and over her, throwing her dagger as she did so. The unexpected move had caught her completely off guard and she had been unable to react in time when it buried itself in her right shoulder. The pain had been quick to be suppressed but the shock of it had already done its work. In that moment of weakness, she had lost her grip on the lacrima in her hand. She had noticed it the second she had felt the lack of weight in her hand. Unfortunately she wasn't the only one who had noticed. For Kelia, the sight of the lacrima must have been played so slowly as the realization kicked in. Both of them knew that without Nirvana, she was powerless to stop such large-scale strikes again. That was all the opening Kelia needed for her to spread her arms out wide, the wind taking shape into feathers as black as night and gathering them all around her body. Godslayer's secret art. Spinning round on her bad leg, a brief burst of pain making its way through the blocks she had tried to put on it, Wendy tried to quickly respond with a spell of her own. Only to hesitate. Her and Kelia's positions from before were now reversed. Now it was Kelia standing in the path of Gildarts. If her attack won against Kelia, he would be dragged into the chaos. She couldn't win this clash. She had to allow Kelia's attack to be the one overpowering her own. But that didn't mean she had to just take it lying down. She didn't plan on dying to such a strike. Wind wrapped around both of her hands as she extended them out to the sides, slowly dragging them through the air and leaving streaks of wind in their wake. Dragon Slayer's secret art. Heavenly gathering of clouds. Kelia's attack was released at her as the girl swung her arms down together, the dense stream of black feathers and wind being unleashed all at once. Wendy took a moment to admire the sight before letting her arms move slightly, allowing the wind barrier of her secret art to form. Shattering Light, Sky Barrier. The spell was nothing more than the part-way form of her Sky Drill spell. It only consisted of the barrier part. However, instead of having it surround both of them, the wind only formed around Wendy. She already knew which secret art would win, however it was not so easy for one secret art to come out unscathed in a battle against another. Rather than wait for that outcome though, she tried a different approach. Ducking down, she began to run towards her own barrier, leaping through it just as Kelia's attack hit. The greatest danger was taking the attack head on, so as long as she stayed in the edges of Kelia's attack she would be able to withstand it. The streams of black feathers provided perfect cover for her as she snaked her way back across towards Kelia, hiding against the edges of the stream so that she wouldn't be detected. It hurt. She could only hide so well by pressing her body almost against the feathers, and many would leave small cuts as she tried to use them to her advantage. That pain was nothing, however, not when she could see where the lacrima she had dropped had fallen. Her hiding room was vanishing though. Kelia's attack was about to end, having already smashed through her wind barrier, so she would have to hope the surprise of her presence would make Kelia falter for a moment. Kicking off the air for one final push, she took the shortest path to her goal. That meant throwing herself straight through the stream of feathers still remaining. She closed her eyes and used her arms as shields across her face, trying to resist the urge to cry out as she broke free and lunged for Nirvana. Her right hand was an inch away when it was suddenly slammed into the ground, pinned there as a sharp piece of rubble trapped her against the ground. This time she couldn't stop herself from letting out a cry, all the carefully constructed blocks she had tried to make to ignore the pain breaking at once. Kelia merely looked down at her old friend coldly as she took her hand away from the makeshift dagger, leaving it there to keep Wendy pinned. Then, turning her attention to the lacrima itself, she picked it up and held it closely to her face. "What the hell is this thing?" she muttered. "You had it in the Grand Magic Games. Well, I guess it's mine now. The winner always gets what the loser had." She barely looked at Wendy as she raised her foot up, placing it over the girl's head as black wind began to cycle all around it. Die. Even with pain screaming at her, Wendy didn't miss that moment. For the first time in the fight, Kelia wasn't focusing on her properly. She thought it was all over. The moment the foot came down, she pulled her head out of the way, the wind scrapping across the side of her face as Kelia's foot slammed into the ground. The damage it caused was enough to break the ruined ground even further, rubble being broken away and freeing the dagger trapping Wendy from the ground below. She shot up in desperation as her left hand struck out towards Kelia, the girl raising an arm in preparation for an attack she assumed was coming. It never did. Rather than go for the strike, Wendy's hand shot right past it and grabbed onto Kelia's own, the lacrima holding Nirvana held tightly between their two palms. "Got you," Wendy muttered as Kelia realized what she had been after, trying to pull back. But Wendy refused to let go, desperate to hold on just long enough for Nirvana to activate. Black and white light shone around their connected hands before slamming into Kelia, the girl freezing in her tracks. Then, finally, the magic ended and Wendy began to fall towards the ground. She was caught before she did so, Kelia holding her tightly in her arms. "Wendy? Wendy?" She could hear the panic in Kelia's voice, and she hadn't thought that hearing such emotion would make her feel so happy. A brief burst of pain was felt as the dagger stuck in her right hand was pulled free before she felt the comforting feeling of Kelia's magic washing over here, her wounds slowly beginning to heal. All the while she heard the same words repeated over and over again, the voice they were coming from desperate to make her hear them. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm dash." She could hear the sound of choking for a moment as Kelia struggled with further words before finally settling to hug her tightly. Her head felt wet before she realized it was simply because of the tears falling on her, Kelia unable to stop herself from crying. "I'm sorry," she heard Kelia managed to say in between sobs. "I didn't mean it. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't mean to abandon you. I'm so sorry." "It's okay," Wendy replied, smiling as she returned the hug. "It's all right now. Everything is fine." "It's not," Kelia muttered, tightening her grip on Wendy as if the girl was some kind of safety blankets for her. "I took his blood. His power flows in me. I can still sense his presence inside me, trying to bring me back." "Don't worry," Wendy spoke back reassuringly. "We can help you. And soon Wywak won't be a problem. Ichigo's here. He won't be able to do it." "Wendy, he doesn't know it." "Wywak. He's been waiting for something like this. He told me. Ichigo's actions. They'll all be for nothing. Then we'll go and warn him. If we hurry, we can make it in time. How about that?" "That sounds. Yes." Loosening her grip on Wendy, Kelia pulled back and gave the girl a big smile before bringing up a hand to wipe her eyes. "Let's hurry. I know a shortcut. If we move quickly we can dash." Kelia's words were completely cut off as her arm dropped, the sight before her making her freeze. "Kelia." Seeing her friend's shocked expression, Wendy turned her head around to see what had shaken her friend so much. The answer was the blonde, long-haired man standing behind her, a hand resting on the hilt of his sword by his side. "So the cat scratched its master, did it?" he asked, causing Kelia to slowly back away, pulling Wendy with her. "I did warn His Majesty, but it is likely he already knew such events would occur. That was why he had me go and observe you." And as he anticipated, the Sky Priestess over there managed to perform a miracle using the power of Nirvana. "I had my doubts such a girl even possessed, let alone could utilize, such power, but I should have known better than to doubt His Majesty. A mistake I must try to not make again. Now then," he added as he slowly drew his sword from his sheath. "Which of you pests would like to die first?" No answer greeted him, and instead all he saw was the slow raising of tiny fists. "Shame. I might have been merciful in the death of the first to step forward. I cannot promise you will get such a nice outcome anymore." Pulling his sword completely free, he pointed it at the space in between the two girls. "I guess I'll just have to kill whoever is weaker first." Both Wendy and Kelia were prepared to make the first move. Such thoughts were ripped to shreds when they found the man right them and slashing up with his sword. Kelia reacted on instinct, pushing Wendy away to one side and taking the hit for the both of them, much to Wendy's horror. The sword tore across her chest, but for Kelia the pain was nothing. In a few moments it would be closed shut, not leaving even a single mark. So instead she lunged at the man before her, wrapping black wind around her fist as she slammed it straight towards the man's head. "Pathetic." The man's words cut through the air like a blade, Kelia's eyes widening as his stepped back far enough for her attack to miss. It may have only been a step, but to Kelia the action had happened so suddenly, her fist missing him by centimeters. Wind scrapped across the man, but he paid it no heed as he tightened his grip on his sword and swung. Kelia was already trying to pull back when it cut straight down at her, going from left shoulder right down to her hip. It would have gotten further if not for the hands desperately clinging onto the blade, holding it steady despite the damage the edge was doing to Kelia's hands. Sighing in annoyance, he merely raised his foot and slammed it into her. The impact sent Kelia flying back through the air as her body left his sword, her hands forcefully pulled from the edge's grasp. No attempts were made to slow her descent, which resulted in Kelia hitting the ground roughly, unmoving. However, while she herself may have not been moving, the wind around her was another matter, being drawn in towards her injuries as it attempted to repair the damage that had been done. "Such a pest," the man muttered as he shook his head. "You're still regenerating. I guess I will have to use more extreme methods to kill you." "Kelia." The man merely tilted his head towards the sound, eyeing the younger of the two girls as her right fist tightened until her fingers drew blood. She was angry. No, scratch that. She was furious. The light of Nirvana shone, and for the first time in the brief one-sided fight he showed wariness, pulling back a few steps as he raised his sword ready in defense. His breath seemed to leave him as the light intensified, the wind around Wendy intensifying with her anger as she let out a scream of rage. Suddenly she was rushing towards him, kicking of the air with a large torrent of wind wrapped around her arm. The size of it wouldn't have bothered him if it wasn't for the girl's close proximity to the wall, the wind close enough that it was tearing it to shreds. He still found it hard to breathe too. Had she used Nirvana to forcefully bring all the air she could draw upon to her? Whatever the case, this attack was a dangerous one. And depending on how many times she could use it, this fight could drag on longer than he wanted and give the Kelia time to recover and add her own firepower to the mix. His senses briefly sensed the energy of the attack before he lowered his sword to his side, completely unafraid. This attack wouldn't kill him. Wendy was oblivious to all of this as she let out a scream of rage, swinging her arm straight down at the man. The wind was all released at once, as if a hurricane had been unleashed at one single point before the man. As such it held nothing back, slamming into him with full force and tearing his clothes to shreds. The ground ripped with the man as his body was attacked by thousands of slashes of wind, leaving him as nothing more than a bleeding mess before Wendy. His hair had even been cut short from his waist to his neck and his arms were now hanging limp at his sides, his sword fallen to the floor. It looked like he would even fall over with a sudden gust of wind. Wendy's anger slowly began to fade as she realized the state she had put her opponent in. She was about to take a step away in shock, afraid of how far she had just gone, only for a smile from the man to freeze her in her tracks. The next moment Wendy was struggling to stand, every nerve in her body screaming in pain. Cuts that had not been present before suddenly appeared on her body in an equal magnitude to the ones inflicted on the man before her. Her arms stopped working as they fell to her sides, Nirvana slipping from her grasp and landing on the floor by her feet. Even her vision was shaky, made worse by the blood spilling from the countless wounds. "What do you think of my power?" the man asked. "I possess an interesting script called the balance. It allows me to manipulate the fortune of everything around me. You had a lot of good fortune in damaging me so much so it was only fair, to balance the scales, that you should receive the same amount of misfortune as I did. So that was what happened. But for Wendy, such a thing wouldn't matter. Kelia would be up soon and this man would not be a threat for much longer. This fight is over, right?" The man's smile never faded as the shock on her face reappeared, a large shield with the Quincy cross slowly forming around his left arm where a small Quincy bangle could be seen. Such arrogance. Shaking his body from side to side, the man forced his right hand to hit the shield. The moment it did, Wendy screamed. She hadn't meant to, it was just that all the pain she felt was suddenly doubled. And when her eyes could properly focus, she felt all her hopes drop at the sight before her. Every wound the man had was healing, or rather it would be more accurate to say it was vanishing. His clothes were repairing while his hair lengthened once again until it was the original length, all the while the shield he held became more and more damaged with each second. And the more damaged the shield got, the worse the pain got for her. "My Froen shield is quite special. It's a tool His Majesty developed for me to further enhance my power. After having you share in my misfortune, I can then transfer my misfortune onto this shield. All that misfortune taken from me is then reflected onto others, forcing those that dared stand against me to experience even more misfortune." Wendy couldn't even say anything in response, her legs giving way as she fell face first into the ground. The man showed no surprise at the sight, merely picking up his sword and walking towards the downed dragon slayer. Raising his sword up, he briefly paused as he took note of the other girl. Kelia was still struggling to get to her feet even as her wounds continued to bleed, the proof that she had yet to fully recover. "Get away from her. I do not take orders from pests like you." Flipping his sword around so that the tip of the blade was hovering about Wendy, he prepared to end her life here and there. "No. Don't. Stop." The man paid no heed to her cries. His sword was about to stab down when he froze, an enormous amount of magical power right behind him. For the first time in a long while, he felt true fear from what he felt, as if there was an impossible threat about to strike. His blade lashed out before he was sent flying anyway, skidding down the corridor further into the prison and away from both Wendy and Kelia. "Who is there?" he asked before his eyes landed on the one responsible for knocking him away. The sight he saw made his eyes widen in shock at who was before him. Standing shakily on one leg, Gildarts held his ground beside Wendy, the very air around his missing arms and legs shattering over and over again. The very air was growing heavy just from being close to the man, and it felt like if it was kept up for any longer then the whole base might even start to shake. "You aren't going to harm them any further," Gildarts growled out, struggling to stay steady with his magic in action. "If you want to, you'll have to get through me first. So I recommend you give it your best shot. Otherwise I'll leave nothing of you but pieces." Protector of the Fairies. Check the description for the links to the author.